The world you think you know from Ark Raiders is only a fraction of the story, and tonight we are going to spend the next 8 hours exploring what happened to every corner of the planet when Ark descended from orbit and tore civilization apart, because the answer, when you pull all the lore together, is far more complicated and far more human than you might expect. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. I made this video because the lore of Ark Raiders has this quality where the closer you look, the more questions you find stacked underneath the ones you started with. Most content about Ark Raiders lore focuses on the raider factions, the underground communities, the specific characters whose audio logs and personal notes you piece together across the maps. That stuff is great, and I have covered a lot of it on this channel, but this video is about the parts of the story the game leaves mostly dark, the parts that have to do with the rest of the world, the countries you never visit, the governments you never hear from, the people whose survival or destruction is implied but never shown. When I put this together, I made a deliberate choice to treat silence in the lore as evidence rather than absence. Where the game says nothing about a region, I think that silence is worth examining. Some of what I present here is interpretation, and I will tell you clearly when I'm extrapolating rather than citing something the game establishes directly. Chapter 1. The day Ark arrived and what the world looked like. Before we can talk about whether other countries survived, we need to establish what kind of event we are actually talking about. The arrival of Ark is not something the game explains cleanly in one place. It is described through fragments, through implications, through the way survivors talk about the before and after, as though there is nothing worth saying about the space in between. What we can piece together from environmental storytelling, item descriptions, and scattered audio logs suggests that the descent happened over a period of time rather than all at once. This was not a single moment where the sky turned dark and everything ended. It was a cascade, a rolling catastrophe that moved across the planet in phases, each wave more devastating than the last, leaving communities to scramble and fail before the next wave even arrived to finish the job. The first documented observations of Ark activity in the game's lore point towards something coming from orbit. There are references to orbital phenomena, to things seen in the sky before contact was established, to a period of confusion where governments and scientists tried to classify what they were looking at and kept reaching for comparisons that did not fit. The language used in early survivor accounts, when you find them in the game's environments, suggests a general failure to understand what was happening until the window for an effective response had already closed. This is not unusual for a catastrophe of this scale. History shows that humans are remarkably bad at responding to threats that do not match any template they have prepared for. Ark did not match any template. The closest comparison most military establishments had was something between an asteroid strike and a coordinated foreign attack. An Ark was neither of those things in any form that existing doctrine could address. One thing Ark Raiders is quite consistent about across multiple pieces of lore is that Ark entities are not soldiers in any conventional sense. They do not occupy territory the way armies do. They do not set up command posts or hold ground strategically in a way that human military planners could map and predict and counter. What they do instead is something closer to systematic disruption. They target infrastructure. They go after power grids, communication towers, transportation hubs, water treatment systems, fuel depots, and the digital backbone that modern logistics depends on. The early phase of the invasion, based on what the lore suggests, was less about killing people directly and more about removing the systems that allowed large numbers of people to survive. That is a much more efficient approach to collapsing a civilization than direct confrontation, and it appears to have worked with disturbing speed. This infrastructure targeting behaviour is critical to understand when we think about which countries might have survived and which might not have. A country with extremely centralized infrastructure, where almost everything runs through a small number of critical nodes, is far more vulnerable to this approach than a country with distributed, redundant, or lower technology systems. Military planners have noted for decades that high-tech societies are in some ways more fragile than lower-tech ones, because the complexity of their systems creates exponentially more points of failure. ARC seems to have exploited this with a precision that implies either sophisticated targeting intelligence or a very broad campaign that simply struck everything and let the complexity of interdependence do the rest of the work from there. When we think about the global picture, it helps to imagine the world of ARC raiders as a snapshot of a late 21st century Earth that was somewhat more advanced than our own. The game does not give us an exact year for the invasion, but the technology levels visible in the environments, the equipment used by raiders, and the nature of the infrastructure that ARC targeted all suggest a world that had pushed significantly further into automation and interconnected digital systems than we currently have. There are hints of augmented systems, more sophisticated drone networks, distributed sensor infrastructure, and a level of logistics automation that made global supply chains faster and more efficient than anything that exists today. That dependency on sophisticated interconnected technology shaped everything about what happened when ARC came and started systematically dismantling it. The game's maps as they exist give us our clearest window into what the post-invasion world looks like on the ground. The environments are unmistakably Northern European in character. There are abandoned industrial facilities, collapsed transit infrastructure, the remnants of functioning modern communities that clearly had strong economies and well-maintained public spaces before everything fell apart. The architecture, the signage, the design language of the objects you encounter all point toward a Scandinavian or broadly Northern European setting for the story's main action. This is the part of the world we see most clearly. But the fact that the game shows us this specific region does not mean ARC's arrival was a European event. It just means this is where the story is anchored, at least in what has been revealed so far. Environmental lore in ARC Raiders is dense with detail when you learn to read it systematically. Crates and containers bearing shipping labels and markings from places far from the visible map. Equipment that clearly originated in different manufacturing traditions than the local architecture would suggest. Foods, medicines, and personal items that speak to international supply chains that were still running right up until they were not. A particular medical kit might contain components manufactured on 3 different continents. A personal bag might contain a travel document from a country thousands of kilometers away. All of this points toward a world that was genuinely and deeply globalized at the moment ARC arrived. The invasion did not hit a fragmented collection of isolated nations. It hit an interconnected world, which meant that the disruption of any single major node sent cascading damage through systems that stretched across every continent simultaneously. There are audio logs in the game that describe the early days of the crisis in terms that feel almost mundane compared to what came after. People talking about news reports, about government announcements, about the sense that something serious was happening but that the appropriate authorities were working on it. This is a recognizable pattern from any major disaster in human history. The initial response is almost always characterized by official reassurance and public confusion, a gap between what is actually happening and what institutions are willing or able to communicate honestly. In ARC's case, that gap proved fatal for millions of people who waited for official guidance that never came in any form that could have actually helped them prepare or survive. It is worth noting that the game suggests some degree of early coordination between governments before the infrastructure collapse became irreversible. There are references to international alert systems being activated, to shared military communications in the early days, to something that resembles a coordinated global response being attempted at the highest levels of multiple governments. This is important because it means the story of what happened to other countries is not purely a story of isolated collapses that each played out in complete ignorance of what was happening elsewhere. There was a moment, however brief and however inadequately communicated to the general population, when the world was trying to respond together. Understanding why that coordinated response failed and how quickly it failed tells us a great deal about what each region was left with when it had to start solving the problem entirely on its own. The failure of coordinated response based on what the law suggests was not primarily a failure of willingness. It was a failure of capability at the worst possible moment. ARC's systematic targeting of communication infrastructure meant that the ability to coordinate across borders degraded catastrophically in the early weeks. By the time it became fully clear that this was a species-level threat requiring a unified and sustained response, the systems required to organize that response were already severely damaged and in many cases destroyed. Individual nations, individual military commands, individual cities were increasingly on their own, making decisions with incomplete and rapidly deteriorating information about what was happening anywhere else on the planet. The aftermath of that communications collapse is where the regional stories really begin in earnest. Each area, cut off from global coordination, had to figure out its own approach with the resources it had on hand. The population that had survived the initial infrastructure disruption, the military and civilian assets that were still functional, the local geography, the climate, the existing social structures, the cultural traditions around community organization and mutual aid, all of these factors combined in radically different ways to produce very different outcomes in different parts of the world. In some regions, what emerged from the chaos was surprisingly organized. In others, the chaos simply continued in different forms. What this means for our central question is significant in a way that should frame everything that follows. When we ask whether other countries survived the Ark invasion, we are not really asking whether the physical territories survived. Land does not die. We are asking whether the communities living in those territories managed to hold together through the initial catastrophe and adapt to a fundamentally changed world. The answer to that question, when you read all the available law carefully, is that the answer varies enormously by region, by community size, by local leadership, by available resources, by sheer luck, and by the degree to which local culture and social structures were suited to the specific challenges Ark created. One of the more interesting pieces of law you encounter in Ark Raiders is the evidence of what happened to military forces in the early period of the invasion. The game shows you remnants of military equipment that clearly saw active use against Ark, vehicles with damage patterns consistent with Ark weaponry, defensive fortifications that were clearly planned and constructed by trained engineers and soldiers, ammunition caches positioned with tactical intelligence behind them. All of this suggests that the military response to Ark was real, was organized to a meaningful degree, and was eventually overwhelmed rather than never seriously attempted. The scale of the military remnants scattered across the game's environments implies a significant mobilization on multiple levels of command that ultimately could not stop what Ark was doing. The question of what military assets survived in various countries is one of the most consequential questions for thinking about global survival. A nation whose military remained largely intact through the early chaos of the invasion had an enormous advantage in organizing survivor communities, maintaining some degree of order in contested areas, and conducting meaningful resistance operations against Ark activity. The law gives us hints about this. There are references to military forces that adapted successfully to the new conditions, that pulled back from urban centres and reorganised in less Ark-intensive environments. There are also references to military forces that were destroyed in the early engagements that tried to fight Ark directly on its preferred terms and paid a catastrophic price for it. The pattern of Ark's behaviour as described across the lore suggests something crucial that tends to get overlooked. Ark prioritises disruption over complete annihilation. This is a critical observation that changes the entire framework of the survival question. If Ark's goal were to kill every human being on the planet, the lore we see would look radically different from what it does. Instead, what the game depicts is a civilization that has been crippled but very much not eliminated. Infrastructure is destroyed. Organised governance is largely dissolved at the national and international level. But people persist in large numbers across wide geographic areas. This implies that Ark either cannot or does not choose to pursue total extermination of the human population. That choice or limitation is what makes survival stories possible. One possible reading of Ark's behaviour is that it is following a program designed for a specific set of objectives, and that program does not include some of the things you would expect from a truly hostile intelligence determined to eliminate humanity entirely. Crop fields are not targets. Forests are not burned. Individual human beings who are not presenting as immediate military threats are left alone in many cases, at least in areas outside the most actively contested zones. This selectivity in targeting gives human survivors a set of resources to work with that pure extermination would never allow. The question of why Ark targets what it targets and ignores what it ignores is one of the deeper mysteries of the game's lore, and different interpretations of that question lead to very different conclusions about Ark's ultimate nature and purpose. This theory of programmatic selectivity has significant implications for which regions of the world were most likely to see large-scale survival. Areas with high urban density and heavy infrastructure dependency were devastated first and most completely because they were full of exactly the kinds of targets Ark prioritized. Areas with more dispersed populations, lower infrastructure density, more diverse subsistence strategies, stronger traditions of community self-reliance were hit less comprehensively. The damage was still real and the disruption was still catastrophic, but communities that were already accustomed to functioning with less centralized infrastructure had a dramatically different experience of the Ark invasion than those that depended entirely on systems that were among Ark's first targets. The food chain is one of the most important lenses through which to examine global survival. The preserved foods, ration packs, and agricultural products you encounter in Ark raiders come from somewhere. Some are clearly locally produced from communities within the game's depicted environment. Others show clear evidence of having travelled significant distances before ending up where you find them. The agricultural lore embedded in these items points toward a post-invasion world where farming has not stopped entirely, where someone is still growing food at scale, still processing it, still distributing it through channels that can reach survivor communities. That kind of continued agricultural activity requires significant, ongoing human organisation. You cannot maintain agricultural production through a species-level catastrophe without organised communities protecting the farmland, maintaining the knowledge base, and preserving the social structures that make collective work possible. The water management infrastructure that some survivor communities have maintained, as depicted in various lore pieces, is another indicator of organised survival at scale. Clean water management is one of the most technically demanding aspects of civilization. Maintaining it requires knowledge, equipment, coordination, and ongoing effort. The fact that some communities in the Ark Raiders world have managed to maintain even basic water systems tells us something important about the quality of technical knowledge and organizational capacity that survived the initial catastrophe in at least some areas. You cannot maintain a water system with knowledge that exists only in the heads of 3 frightened survivors. You need a critical mass of technical and organizational capacity, which requires a community of meaningful size. The medical lore in Ark Raiders reveals global connections that speak to widespread survival. The treatments and medical knowledge visible in the game reflect traditions from multiple geographic and cultural origins, not just the pharmaceutical and surgical approaches of the Western medical tradition, but elements of other healing traditions, herbal preparations, techniques that have roots in East Asian, South Asian, African, and indigenous medical practices. Whoever preserved and transmitted the medical knowledge that survivor communities use today drew on a global tradition rather than a single national or regional one. That kind of synthesis requires contact between people from different backgrounds, which requires the survival of people from those backgrounds in the first place. The items you find in the game are a kind of law unto themselves when you catalogue them carefully. Manufactured goods that clearly originated far from where you find them. Equipment with serial numbers and manufacturing codes that suggest production facilities in very different parts of the world. Tools made using techniques that are specific to particular regional manufacturing traditions. Personal effects with origin stories that span continents. All of this is environmental storytelling in the truest sense. And collectively, it suggests a world where goods continue to move even after the invasion, through desperate and informal channels, through raider networks and trading relationships that we only partially see in the game. Things do not move unless people are moving them. People do not move things unless there are communities on both ends of the transaction that have something to offer and something to gain. The radio culture that emerges in the lore of Ark Raiders is particularly significant for thinking about global connectivity and survival. There are references to what seems to be an informal network of radio operators who tried to maintain long-range communication after the collapse of digital infrastructure. Some of these operators were amateurs working with salvaged and improvised equipment. Others were trained military or civilian communications personnel who survived the initial collapse and continued their work because it was the only work they knew how to do that still felt like it might matter. The transmissions they sent and received sometimes contained information about conditions in distant regions that was both precious and terrifying. Precious because it meant other communities existed. Terrifying because of what some of those transmissions described. The content of the transmissions referenced in various lore pieces is evocative, and when you read it carefully, informative. References to large organized communities in specific regions. References to areas where Ark activity had never been as severe as in the worst hit zones. References to communities that had established sustainable food production and were looking to trade. But also references to catastrophic losses, to entire population centres going suddenly and completely silent, to the grim arithmetic of the early survival period when communities were calculating how many people they could support and making terrible decisions about what that meant. What is significant is that the transmissions seem to come from multiple directions, suggesting that the network of surviving communicators was at least partially global in distribution. One of the more unsettling pieces of evidence in the law is the suggestion that some entities, whether governmental, corporate, or organised in some other way, did have significant advance warning of Ark's arrival, and used that warning to protect assets and personnel rather than to prepare or warn the general population. This theme of selective survival, of powerful institutions ensuring their own continuation at the expense of the people they theoretically served, runs through the law in ways that are never entirely explicit but are strongly implied by the evidence. The existence of certain well-preserved facilities, certain groups that seem to have been positioned and equipped in ways that ordinary civilian communities were not, certain hoards of supplies that reflect foresight no ordinary survivor would have had. All of this points toward a story of institutional self-preservation that left most people to face Ark unprepared. Despite all of this, the law also contains abundant evidence of what can only be called extraordinary human solidarity. individuals and communities sharing resources at significant personal cost, people taking serious risks to reach isolated communities and bring them supplies or information, or simply the reassurance of knowing they were not completely alone. Networks of mutual aid that emerged spontaneously in the chaos of the early period without any central organizing authority directing them. The same human capacity for community that built civilization in the first place, reasserting itself under conditions that could not have been worse. This is the counterweight to all of the institutional failure and selfishness in the story, and it deserves its due weight because it is also part of what explains how so many communities survived against odds that should have been insurmountable. The question of children in the post-Ark world is one that the law handles with particular gravity. Children born after the invasion, who have grown up knowing nothing but the post-Ark world, are in many ways the central characters of the longer story the game is telling. They are the generation that will determine whether humanity's recovery is possible, or whether the catastrophe was too complete to come back from. The fact that children are being born and surviving and growing up in post-Ark communities is itself significant evidence of stability and sustainability. Communities in pure survival crisis do not invest in children. They cannot. The presence of childhood in the post-Ark world tells you something important about the conditions that allow it. The education systems that survivor communities have assembled, as depicted across various lore pieces, are both practical and poignant. People teaching children to read from salvaged books, elders passing on agricultural knowledge, construction techniques, medical practices, navigation skills, but also stories, history, the names of cities and countries and people from a world the children never knew and cannot fully imagine. The preservation of cultural memory through oral tradition and whatever physical materials survived the chaos of the early years. This commitment to education and cultural transmission, even in conditions of extreme scarcity, reflects a determination to maintain human identity and knowledge across the catastrophe that goes beyond mere survival. It is the declaration that there is something worth surviving for. The factions within Raider culture tell us something about the ideological diversity that has persisted in the post-Ark world and that connects back to the pre-invasion world in traceable ways. Different factions have different approaches to the fundamental questions of post-Ark existence. How much cooperation is appropriate between communities with competing needs? How resources should be distributed in conditions of scarcity? What the relationship between survivors and Ark zones should be? Whether eventual recovery of something like pre-Ark civilization is a realistic goal worth pursuing, or an illusion that consumes energy better spent on sustainable adaptation to the world as it is. These ideological differences echo political and philosophical traditions that clearly predate Ark's arrival in ways that suggest they have roots in specific cultural communities that survived the invasion with enough continuity to transmit their values forward. The geographic distribution of those cultural echoes in Raider faction ideology gives us another data point for thinking about global survival. If particular pre-invasion philosophical and political traditions are visible in the factions of the post-Ark world, then the communities that carried those traditions survived in numbers sufficient to transmit them. Traditions do not survive in the heads of one or two people. They need communities, institutions, however informal, enough people sharing the same framework of values and interpretation that the tradition feels like a living thing rather than a museum piece. The vitality of the ideological diversity visible in Raider culture implies a corresponding vitality in the various survivor communities from which those traditions descend. Language evidence in Ark Raiders is subtle but worth noting. The game does not make a dramatic point of linguistic diversity, but it is there in the environmental details, item labels in multiple written systems, graffiti and personal notes in what appear to be different scripts and languages, audio logs with accents and speech patterns that suggest speakers from very different parts of the world have contributed to the communities you encounter. All of this is consistent with a survivor population that was not drawn from a single linguistic or cultural tradition. The polyglot quality of the environment suggests that people from many different backgrounds contributed to the formation of these communities, which in turn implies that those backgrounds represent surviving populations from many different parts of the world, not just from the immediate geographic area the game depicts. What all of this foundational evidence points toward, when you step back and look at the full picture, is a world that was struck a devastating blow but was not killed by it. The metaphor that comes to mind is not of a civilization that was erased, but of one that was fragmented, scattered, reduced, stripped of most of its infrastructure and institutions, but still fundamentally present in the form of millions of people who continue to think and remember and organize and hope. The question of whether specific countries survived in any meaningful sense is more nuanced than a simple yes or no can capture. What survived in most cases was not the country as an institutional entity. What survived was the people, the culture, the knowledge, and the human connections that constitute a civilization in its deepest sense. The Ark Raiders lore is explicit that the invasion did not happen all at once and did not end. Ark is still present in the world of the game, still active, still a threat, still reshaping the landscape of what human survival looks like from day to day. This means that the story of whether other countries survived is not a past tense story. It is a present tense one. Communities that survived the initial invasion may have since been destroyed or severely diminished. Communities that were initially devastated may have recovered in ways nobody could have predicted. The situation is dynamic, and the picture we can assemble from the available lore is a snapshot of an ongoing story rather than the final accounting of a concluded one. With that global context established, we can turn to the regional evidence. The regional chapters will go through the world geographically, drawing on everything the lore suggests about what happened in each area. Some of these will have more direct evidence than others. For the regions where the game gives us almost nothing explicit, I will be clear about that and about how much of what I present is inference from established patterns versus something the game directly tells us. But the question is too important to leave unexamined, and every piece of evidence, even indirect evidence, gets us closer to a picture of the world that Ark made. One more piece of global context before the regional breakdown. The question of what happened to the world's nuclear arsenals during the Ark invasion is something the lore touches on obliquely, but which has enormous implications. Several pieces of lore reference military commands being given in the early period of the invasion that suggest nuclear response was considered and possibly attempted in some form. The results of those attempts are not depicted directly in the game, but the state of the world we see does not suggest large-scale nuclear exchange occurred in the depicted regions. The environmental signatures you encounter in certain zones seem consistent with Ark-related phenomena rather than nuclear detonation aftermath. The absence of obvious nuclear devastation in the depicted environments is a significant data point in itself. It suggests either that nuclear weapons were not used in these areas, or that enough time has passed for some environmental recovery to have occurred, or that Ark neutralized nuclear assets before they could be deployed effectively. The third option is consistent with what the lore suggests about Ark's capabilities and targeting priorities. If Ark identified nuclear systems as among the most powerful infrastructure assets it needed to disable, the early targeting of those systems would explain both why nuclear response appears to have been largely neutralized and why the landscapes we see are not irradiated wastelands. It would also tell us something about Ark's capabilities that is simultaneously reassuring and deeply unsettling in its implications. Pre-existing social inequalities shaped the contours of survival in ways the law acknowledges without dwelling on. Communities that were already economically marginalized, already functioning on the edges of the formal infrastructure networks that ARC targeted, already practiced in forms of mutual aid and community self-reliance that the formal economy had never bothered to provide, found themselves in a terrible, but in some ways less immediately, catastrophic situation than communities whose lives had been entirely structured around systems that ARC destroyed in the first weeks. This is not a comfortable observation. It does not mean marginalized communities suffered less. They suffered enormously. But the specific character of the suffering was different, and the adaptive tools available were different in ways that affected who survived and how. The corporate dimension of the pre-invasion world is another factor that shaped survival outcomes in ways the law hints at. Large multinational corporations in the world of ARC raiders had resources, capabilities, and global networks that in some respects exceeded those of national governments. The evidence of corporate survival infrastructure, corporate prepared facilities, corporate response protocols that suggests some companies had modelled ARC-like scenarios and prepared for them is scattered through the law in ways that raise more questions than they answer. Who prepared and why and what they did with their survival advantage in the aftermath of the invasion is a thread that runs through several of the more unsettling corners of the ARC raiders' story. The relationship between surviving corporate entities and surviving governmental remnants in the post-invasion world is something the law points toward as a significant source of tension and conflict. Governments that lost their capacity to function as governments but retained some degree of legitimacy in the eyes of survivor communities. Corporate entities that retained operational capability and resources but lacked the legitimacy that comes from democratic mandate. The collision between those two forms of post-ARC power is one of the underlying structural conflicts of the world the game depicts, and it plays out differently in different regions depending on which form of pre-ARC power had more infrastructure and personnel survive in each area. The environmental artwork in ARC Raiders contains references to specific pre-invasion events and decisions that shaped the world ARC arrived into. Reading these references carefully gives you a sense of the political and social climate that characterized the last years before the invasion. There was tension, there was inequality, there was technological acceleration, outpacing governance, and ethical frameworks. There was a sense in many of the pre-invasion documents you find that the world was already unstable, already in some kind of transition crisis, when ARC arrived and compressed whatever was going to happen next into a catastrophic acceleration. The invasion did not create the fractures in human civilization. In many ways, it simply exposed and deepened fractures that were already there. One of the most important things to understand about ARC Raiders' overall lore structure is that the game is designed around a world that has already been living with ARC for some time. The survivors you meet, the communities you encounter, the factions you interact with, none of these are in their first days of shock and crisis. They have had time to develop responses, to build cultures, to create social structures and informal institutions. The history of those developments is embedded in the world as environmental storytelling, and reading that history gives us our best evidence for thinking about what was happening in all the parts of the world the game does not show us directly. Because the same human instincts and capacities that produced these visible survivor cultures were at work in every part of the planet, even the parts that exist only as silence in the lore. The patterns of ARC behavior that have been established through extended contact and hard experience are something survivor communities have clearly been cataloguing and sharing for some time. The fact that raiders can navigate ARC zones, can anticipate ARC patrol patterns, can exploit ARC behavioral limitations, tells you that there is a significant body of accumulated knowledge about ARC that has been developed and transmitted across communities over whatever time period the post-invasion world represents. That knowledge development requires communication between communities, requires sharing of information across distances, requires some kind of network that extends beyond any single settlement. The existence of that network, implied by the sophisticated ARC knowledge that raiders demonstrate, is another piece of evidence for ongoing connectivity between surviving communities in different parts of the world. The season cycles visible in the game's environments tell us something about the fundamental health of the biosphere in the depicted region. The fact that seasons continue to turn, that plant life persists and grows and follows its natural cycles, that animal life is present and in some cases thriving in ways that human retreat from the landscape has paradoxically enabled, tells us that ARC's campaign has not included deliberate ecological destruction of the kind that would make the landscape uninhabitable. The world is damaged in specific targeted ways that map onto human infrastructure and human technology. The underlying natural systems remain functional. That is perhaps the most hopeful piece of information embedded in the game's environmental design. We're going to move now into the regional chapters. Chapter 2 covers Europe in detail because that is the region the game gives us the most direct evidence about. After that, we will move through North America, Russia, and Central Asia, East Asia, the Middle East, Africa, South America, and the Pacific region, before turning to look at underground survival networks, and then at the overall picture of scattered signals and what they tell us about the present state of humanity in the Ark Raiders world. Each of these chapters will build on the foundational context we have established here, and together they should give you the most comprehensive picture of global survival in this lore that has been assembled in one place. The evidence available in the lore, when you read it in its entirety and pay attention to all of its layers, does not depict a dead world, it depicts a badly wounded one. A world where the institutional structures of the old civilization are mostly gone, where the infrastructure that modern life depended on is largely destroyed, where death and hardship are constant realities for everyone alive, but also a world where millions of people continue to exist, where communities function and develop, where culture and knowledge persist and even grow, where the fundamental human drives toward connection and creativity and resilience continue to operate even under conditions designed to defeat them. The world Ark made is terrible. It is genuinely terrible in ways that the game communicates with real power. But it is not over. Chapter 2. Europe, continent under siege. Europe is the region we can speak about with the most confidence in the context of Ark Raiders lore, because the game's primary environments are set here. The Northern European character of the game's maps, the Scandinavian architecture and landscape, the specific kind of industrial and post-industrial infrastructure visible in the ruins, all of this gives us a detailed ground-level picture of what Ark's campaign looks like in this part of the world. But Europe is a large and diverse continent, and the specific corner the game depicts is only one piece of a much larger story. To understand what happened to Europe as a whole, we need to take what we learn from the depicted environments and extrapolate carefully across the full geographic and cultural range of a continent that was, at the time of Ark's arrival, among the most densely populated, most economically developed, and most institutionally complex regions on the planet. Scandinavia, the apparent setting of the game's primary maps, is an interesting place to anchor this story. The Scandinavian countries at the time of Ark's arrival were characterized by relatively high levels of social trust, strong public institutions, well-developed welfare infrastructure, and populations that were culturally accustomed to collective action and community responsibility. They also had relatively advanced and centralized infrastructure systems, which made them vulnerable to Ark's targeting approach in very specific ways. The power grids in particular were sophisticated, interconnected, and absolutely critical to daily life in climates where winter without heating is a survival issue. Ark's early disruption of power infrastructure in this region would have been catastrophic in a way that the same disruption in a warmer climate might not have been. The evidence of winter hardship in the game's environments is significant. The way certain spaces are organized, the kinds of supplies that were clearly prioritized in survival caches, the evidence of improvised heating solutions, all of this tells a story of communities grappling with cold in ways that push the limits of survival. Ark's timing in relationship to seasonal cycles in the northern European region is not something the law makes explicit, but the implications are important. A major infrastructure disruption that coincided with the onset of winter in Scandinavia would have created immediate life-threatening conditions for enormous numbers of people, regardless of their response to Ark directly. Cold is an adversary that does not wait for you to figure out your strategy. Despite this, the law suggests that survival rates in the Scandinavian region were not negligible. The communities that existed before the invasion had characteristics that made them resilient in specific ways. Strong social cohesion meant that community responses to the crisis were more coordinated than in more individualistic cultural contexts. A strong tradition of outdoor skills and practical knowledge about winter survival gave ordinary people capabilities that were genuinely useful in the post-Ark environment. The existence of summer cottages and rural properties distributed across the landscape gave urban populations places to retreat to that were outside the most intensely targeted urban infrastructure zones. None of these factors made the survival easy, but they made it more possible than it might otherwise have been. The military remnants visible in the game's environments suggest that Scandinavian defense forces engaged Ark directly in the early period and paid a significant price for it. The damage patterns on military vehicles and equipment are consistent with Ark combat, and the positioning of defensive fortifications suggests a command that was thinking tactically about holding specific positions. The failure of those positions is written into the landscape. Defensive lines that were clearly overrun, supply depots that were destroyed before they could be used, communication relays that were targeted with what seems like deliberate precision. What is left is the evidence of a genuine military effort that ran out of the ability to continue before it ran out of the will to fight. The civilian survival evidence is in some ways more compelling than the military evidence in the game's environments. The kinds of improvisation visible in the spaces where people clearly sheltered and lived for extended periods after the initial crisis tells a story of practical, creative, determined survival. Heating systems assembled from whatever was available, water collection and filtration setups that were clearly designed by people who understood what they needed and figured out how to get it. Food storage arrangements that reflect hard-won knowledge about what keeps and what does not. Informal systems for maintaining communal spaces. All of this is the evidence of communities that were doing more than simply not dying. They were living in the fullest sense of what that means under the circumstances. The question of what happened to the rest of Western Europe during the Ark invasion is one where we have to rely more heavily on inference than on direct law evidence. The United Kingdom, France, Germany, the Benelux countries, the Iberian Peninsula, Italy, all of these represent densely populated, highly developed regions with their own distinct characteristics and vulnerability profiles. What the law suggests about the overall pattern of the Ark invasion, combined with what we know about the specific characteristics of each of these regions, allows us to make some reasonable assessments about what happened and what might have survived. The United Kingdom presents an interesting case for Ark's invasion because of its island geography. Surrounded by water with a finite coastline, the UK had a natural defensive perimeter that land-based threats would have to cross to reach the interior of the country. Ark, of course, did not come by sea or land, it came from above. The island geography that would have been a significant advantage against conventional invasion was largely irrelevant against an adversary that descended from orbit. However, the UK's island status had a secondary effect that may have been more meaningful. The isolation of island infrastructure meant that the cascade effect of interconnected infrastructure failure may have played out somewhat differently, with the boundaries of the British electrical grid and communication networks coinciding more closely with national boundaries than in continental Europe, where everything was deeply interwoven across borders. France is another country with specific characteristics worth considering in light of the Ark invasion pattern. France's energy infrastructure at the time of the invasion was heavily dependent on nuclear power, which represented both a specific vulnerability and a potential factor in whatever happened to nuclear assets globally during the crisis. The centralized nature of French state institutions, which concentrated enormous decision-making power in a relatively small set of national entities, would have made those institutions both potentially more effective in the initial crisis and more completely disabled when they inevitably failed. France also has a significant rural interior that is far less infrastructure dense than the Paris Basin or the major industrial cities of the north and east. What that rural France looked like after Ark disrupted the systems that connected it to the rest of the country is something the law points toward rather than shows. Germany at the time of Ark's arrival was one of the most industrially sophisticated and economically complex societies on the planet. The manufacturing tradition that made Germany central to the global economy also created an enormous dependency on supply chains, energy systems, and logistics networks that Ark's campaign would have targeted with particular intensity. German industrial infrastructure was dense, interconnected, and deeply integrated with the rest of Europe's economic systems. The disruption of that infrastructure would have had ripple effects across the entire continent. At the same time, Germany's geography, positioned at the heart of the European continent, meant that German survivor communities would have had access to overland connections with communities in multiple directions, a factor that could support longer-term resilience through trade and mutual aid. Eastern Europe represents a region that was, in many respects, at an interesting transitional point at the time of Ark's arrival. The countries of the former Eastern Bloc had undergone decades of post-communist development that had significantly improved their infrastructure and living standards, while also increasing their dependency on the kinds of centralized systems that Ark targeted. But the memory of having functioned under less infrastructure-dependent conditions was still relatively recent in many of these communities, held in the knowledge of our older generations who remembered the specific skills and social strategies of an earlier era. That living memory of a less infrastructure-dependent way of life may have given Eastern European communities resources in the post-Ark world that more comprehensively modernized societies did not have to the same degree. Poland specifically is worth examining because of its geographic and cultural characteristics. A large country with significant agricultural capacity, a population with a strong national identity and historical experience of catastrophic disruption and recovery, and a military tradition that had been significantly developed and modernized in the pre-invasion era. The law does not give us explicit information about Poland's fate, but the combination of these factors suggests a survival story that would have been difficult and costly, but potentially more robust than in some of the more comprehensively urbanized and infrastructure-dependent societies to its west. The Polish agricultural heartland, if it survived Ark's early disruption campaigns with some functionality, would have represented a significant resource for survivor communities across a wide area of Central Europe. The survival of cultural institutions in Europe is something the law touches on in ways that are both heartbreaking and hopeful. There are references to deliberate efforts to preserve cultural materials, to protect libraries and archives, to maintain the physical records of European civilization against the chaos of the early period. museums that were sealed, libraries that were relocated, archives that were copied onto more durable media. None of this was coordinated on the scale that would have been needed to preserve everything. Most of it was lost. But the deliberate nature of even partial preservation efforts tells us about the values of the communities that made those choices and about their understanding that the cultural record was something worth making sacrifices for. The network of monasteries, old fortified towns, and ancient community structures that dot the European landscape turned out to be unexpectedly relevant in the post-Ark world. Many of these structures, built in earlier centuries precisely for defensive purposes and community survival, found new purpose as gathering points for survivor communities. Their thick walls, their wells, their cellars, their historical independence from the modern infrastructure grid made them more survivable than modern urban environments in the specific conditions Ark created. The irony of 21st century survivors retreating into medieval infrastructure is not lost on the lore, which acknowledges it in several of the more reflective survivor accounts you can find in the game. The question of European population distribution in the post-Ark era is something the game gives us glimpses of through the social structures of the communities you encounter. The communities depicted are relatively small. They are tight-knit. They have developed specific local traditions and social structures, but they are clearly aware of other communities elsewhere, and they have relationships, however tenuous, with people and groups beyond their immediate vicinity. This pattern of small communities aware of a broader network of similar communities is consistent with a post-Ark Europe that has been fragmented into many smaller units, but has not been reduced to complete isolation. The connections are thinner than they once were, but they exist. The agricultural situation in post-Ark Europe is worth examining in some detail because it is one of the most critical factors for long-term survival at scale. Europe had, at the time of Ark's arrival, highly productive agricultural systems that fed not only its own population, but contributed significantly to global food exports. Those systems were deeply mechanized, heavily dependent on energy inputs, chemical inputs, and sophisticated logistics networks. Ark's disruption of the energy and logistics infrastructure would have devastated agricultural production in the short term, creating immediate food crisis conditions for urban populations in particular. But the underlying agricultural land itself survived. The knowledge of how to farm it survived in some form. And over time, communities that had retreated to or remained in agricultural regions would have been able to begin rebuilding food production systems, even if on a much more labour-intensive and lower-yield basis than before. The fishing communities of coastal Europe deserve particular attention in thinking about post-Ark survival. Communities that depended primarily on the sea for their food supply, rather than on the complex industrialized agricultural systems of the interior, had a significant resilience advantage in the specific conditions Ark created. Fishing boats that did not depend on electronic systems to function. Knowledge of the sea and its resources that was independent of any digital infrastructure. Community structures organized around the rhythms of ocean harvesting rather than industrial production schedules. The fishing communities of Norway, Iceland, the Faroe Islands, the Atlantic coast of France and Spain, the Adriatic and Aegean coasts of southern Europe. All of these had characteristics that made them potentially among the most immediately resilient communities in Europe when the crisis hit. Iceland presents a particularly interesting case that the lore hints at without fully exploring. Geographically remote, with a small population, strong geothermal energy resources that are naturally independent of any larger grid system, a robust fishing tradition, and a social culture characterized by high levels of community solidarity and practical self-reliance. Iceland's survival probability in an Ark-style invasion is, based on the patterns the lore establishes, quite high. The question is what Iceland would be able to do with that survival, how much it could remain connected to the rest of the world, and whether its remote success would eventually make it a destination for refugees from more devastated areas, or whether its very remoteness would leave it isolated in ways that limited its long-term trajectory. The southern European experience of the Ark invasion would have had its own distinct character. The Mediterranean coast of France, Spain, Italy, and Greece, the Balkans, the arc of countries from Portugal to Turkey, all of these faced Ark's campaign with a specific set of resources and vulnerabilities. The warmer climate reduced the acute, life-threatening dimension of infrastructure collapse that made the northern European winter so immediately deadly. But southern European societies were in many cases characterized by high urban density, particularly in coastal cities, combined with interior regions that were less developed and less infrastructure dependent. This division within southern European countries created internal dynamics where coastal urban populations were devastated and rural interior populations had more immediate survival capacity. The Mediterranean Sea itself is worth considering as a factor in southern European post-Ark dynamics. A relatively enclosed sea connecting the coastlines of 3 continents, the Mediterranean had historically functioned as one of the most important routes for human movement and exchange in the world. In the post-Ark environment, with overland infrastructure compromised and the satellite navigation systems that modern shipping depended on disabled or unreliable, the simpler sailing and navigation traditions that had been largely superseded by modern technology would have become relevant again. Communities with the knowledge to sail without electronic navigation, to use the wind and stars and coastal landmarks to move across the sea, would have had connection to a much wider world than purely land-based communities. The Balkans represent a region where the specific political and social history of the area would have shaped post-Ark survival dynamics in complicated ways. A region characterized by complex ethnic, religious, and political divisions that had generated significant conflict in living memory. The Balkans entered the Ark crisis with established fault lines that might either be suspended in the face of shared catastrophe or might be exacerbated by the resource pressures and breakdown of state authority that Ark created. The law does not give us explicit information about what happened in the Balkans, but the general pattern the game establishes of post-Ark communities developing distinct identities and sometimes conflicting interests suggests that the Balkans' pre-existing complexity did not simplify in the aftermath of Ark's arrival. The survival of European languages and literary traditions is something the law treats as a matter of genuine cultural concern within the post-Ark communities. There are references to debates within survivor communities about language, about whether maintaining the diversity of European languages is a practical priority when resources are limited and communication needs favor simplicity and mutual intelligibility. These are exactly the kinds of debates that communities facing existential pressure have always had about cultural preservation, and the fact that they are happening at all in the depicted communities tells you that cultural identity is still a live concern rather than a luxury that has been entirely set aside. Communities that are having debates about language preservation are communities that have survived enough to have cultural debates. That is significant. The European scientific community is another thread worth following in the law. Europe at the time of Ark's arrival housed a significant proportion of the world's research institutions, universities, laboratories, and scientific personnel. The law suggests that some of these institutions made deliberate choices in the early period of the crisis to prioritize the preservation of scientific knowledge and the protection of scientific personnel. There are references to research archives that were protected, to groups of scientists who maintained some degree of organized activity well into the post-invasion period, to informal networks of technical knowledge that persisted even when the institutional structures that had originally generated that knowledge were long gone. The scientific tradition in Europe did not end with Ark's invasion. It went underground, fragmented, and adapted, but the evidence suggests it continued. The specific challenge of European infrastructure interdependence deserves more attention than it typically gets in discussions of Ark Raiders lore. By the time of Ark's arrival, European electricity grids, gas pipelines, railway networks, and communication infrastructure were deeply integrated across national borders in ways that created both efficiency and extreme fragility. The failure of a major power interconnection in one country cascaded into failures in neighbouring countries faster than any government could respond. The law suggests that this interconnected fragility is exactly why Ark's infrastructure targeting campaign was so rapidly devastating in Europe specifically. The very integration that had been celebrated as a triumph of European cooperation became the mechanism through which a targeted disruption in one place became a continent-wide catastrophe almost instantly. The refugee and migration dynamics of the Ark invasion in Europe would have created massive population movements in the early period, the evidence of which is embedded in the demographic character of the survivor communities the game depicts. People fleeing devastated urban centres, military families retreating to rural areas when urban bases became untenable, scientific and technical personnel relocating to wherever there were resources to continue working, farmers who were suddenly the most valuable people in any community. All of this movement mixed populations that had previously been geographically separated, creating survivor communities with diverse origins whose cultural composition does not map cleanly onto any pre-invasion national identity. The specific law pieces that deal with the Scandinavian environment contain references to community practices that clearly have deep roots in the specific cultural traditions of the region. The emphasis on collective decision-making, the specific approaches to resource management, the relationship with the natural environment that reflects centuries of adaptation to this specific climate and landscape. These cultural continuities are not incidental. They are the evidence that the communities depicted in the game are not simply generic survivor communities that could have been placed anywhere. They are specifically rooted in this place and this tradition, which tells you that the cultural and demographic continuity between pre-Ark Northern European communities and the communities you see in the game is real and meaningful, even if it has been severely disrupted and partially reconstituted. The question of European governance in the post-Ark world is one the law engages with through the character of the communities you encounter rather than through explicit political description. The pre-Ark governments of Europe are largely absent as functioning entities in the game's world. The European Union, the most significant supranational governance structure in the region, is clearly not functioning in any meaningful institutional sense. National governments are at best ghost institutions, with whatever legitimacy they retain being contested by other power structures and not backed by any meaningful capacity to enforce decisions or deliver services. What has replaced them is a patchwork of local authority structures that reflect the specific personalities, ideologies, and power relationships of the communities that created them. Yet governance has not disappeared. It has just become radically localized and informal. Communities have leaders. They have rules. They have processes for making collective decisions, for resolving conflicts, for allocating resources and responsibilities. These governance structures bear no formal relationship to the pre-Ark legal and political frameworks of Europe. They did not inherit their authority from any prior institution. They created their authority from the specific conditions they operate in and the consent of the people they govern. This is a fascinating and in some ways hopeful development because it suggests that human beings' inclination toward governance and collective self-organization did not require the specific institutional forms that Ark destroyed. The impulse persisted and found new expressions. The relationship between post-Ark European communities and the physical remnants of the Old World is complex and is depicted with real nuance in the game's environmental storytelling. The ruins of the Old World are simultaneously a resource and a burden. A resource because they contain materials, knowledge, equipment, and supplies that surviving communities need and actively retrieve. A burden because they are evidence of what was lost, because they attract Ark activity, because navigating them is dangerous and emotionally costly. The raider culture that has developed in the game's environments has developed specific practices and protocols around engaging with the Old World's remnants that reflect this complexity. Raiders are not casual about what they do. They approach it with a mixture of practical necessity and something that looks very much like grief. The medical challenges of the post-Ark European world are something the lore deals with in ways that illuminate both the difficulties and the resilience of surviving communities. The collapse of pharmaceutical supply chains, the loss of hospital infrastructure, the dispersal of the medical personnel who survived the initial crisis, all of these created immediate and severe public health challenges. The diseases that modern medicine had controlled, the complications of injury and illness that modern medical infrastructure had routinely managed, reasserted themselves in communities that suddenly lacked the systems to address them. The lore suggests that the medical response to this was improvisational and often terrible in its outcomes, but also characterized by a determined effort to preserve and apply whatever medical knowledge was available. The specific environmental conditions of the game's Northern European setting tell us something about the long-term survivability of the region. The climate, while challenging in winter, is fundamentally habitable and agriculturally productive. The forests provide timber for construction and heating. The freshwater resources are extensive, and in the absence of the industrial activity that was contaminating them before Ark may actually be recovering. The wildlife freed from the pressure of intensive human land use is reasserting itself in the landscape in ways that provide food resources for communities that develop the skills to access them. The underlying ecology of Northern Europe is not broken. It is different from what it was, in some ways more robust, and the communities living within it have access to a natural resource base that can support human life for the indefinitely long term. The artistic and creative output of European survivor communities is something the lore mentions, in ways that feel important even when they are brief. References to music being made, to stories being told, to visual art being created on whatever surfaces are available. These are not luxuries in the post-Ark world. They are part of the essential human activity of maintaining sanity and community cohesion under conditions that would otherwise be psychologically crushing. The specific cultural traditions of Europe, its musical traditions, its storytelling traditions, its visual art traditions, have deep roots that survived the destruction of the institutions that formerly housed and transmitted them. Those traditions live in people, and they continue to express themselves in the communities those people form. As we move forward in the narrative of European post-Ark survival, it becomes important to acknowledge what remains unknown. Large portions of Europe are silent in the lore. The game does not tell us what happened in most of Germany, most of France, most of Spain, most of Italy, most of the Balkans, most of Eastern Europe. The silence could mean devastation. It could mean isolation. It could mean communities that are surviving but that have not yet been connected to the wider survivor networks that would bring them into the lore's frame of reference. The absence of information is not the same as the absence of survival. It is the absence of contact, which is a different and more hopeful thing. The patterns we have established for Northern Europe, the combination of initial devastation with subsequent community formation and adaptation, the preservation of cultural knowledge and practical skills, the development of informal governance structures and trade networks, the ongoing negotiation between the demands of survival and the persistence of cultural identity. All of these patterns are likely to appear in some form in every surviving European community, regardless of where it is located. The specific expression of those patterns will be shaped by local geography, by cultural tradition, by the specific character of Ark's presence in each area, and by the accidents of which people and which resources happen to survive in close enough proximity to form a functional community. But the basic human story is the same everywhere the basic human story has always been told. The relationship between European survivor communities and Ark itself is depicted as one of ongoing, intimate, daily negotiation. Ark is not something that happened in the past in the game's world. It is something that is happening right now, that is present in the landscape, that shapes every decision about where to go and what to do and what is worth risking. The communities that have survived long enough to develop a raider culture have developed it in response to this ongoing presence, have developed it as a way of continuing to live and even to thrive within the specific constraints Ark imposes. That adaptation, that developed capacity to operate within the arc of Ark's influence without being destroyed by it, is the central achievement of European survival in the post-invasion world. The evidence from European law ultimately suggests a continent that has been fundamentally transformed rather than destroyed. The densely populated, heavily urbanized, deeply institutionalized Europe that existed before Ark's arrival is gone in the sense that its physical infrastructure and formal institutions are largely gone. But the people, the culture, the knowledge, the human networks, these things have persisted in diminished and altered forms across a continent that was always more than the infrastructure that once organized it. Whether that persistence eventually develops into something that can genuinely be called a recovery, or whether it remains at the level of survival without progress, is a question the law leaves open, and it is the right question to leave open. The answer depends on choices that have not yet been made by people who are still trying to figure out what kind of world they're trying to build. Chapter 3. North America. The fractured resistance. North America occupies a peculiar position in the lore of Ark Raiders. It is not the primary geographic setting of the game, and the lore that pertains specifically to North America is fragmentary compared to what you find embedded in the Northern European environments. Yet North America keeps appearing in the peripheral evidence, in supply chain documentation, in radio transmission references, in the origin markings on certain equipment and supplies, in the ideological lineage of certain raider faction positions that seem to have clear roots in specific North American political and cultural traditions. North America is present in the Ark Raiders world as an absence that keeps asserting itself, a region large enough and significant enough that its fate in the post-invasion world has consequences that reach all the way to the Northern European communities the game depicts most directly. To understand what the lore suggests happened in North America, we need to start with what North America looked like at the time of Ark's arrival. A continent with three major nations, the United States, Canada, and Mexico, each with very different characteristics in terms of population distribution, infrastructure profile, military capacity, and cultural approach to collective action and community organization. At the top end of the economic development spectrum was the United States, a country with the world's most powerful military, extremely sophisticated and extensive infrastructure, high urban concentration, deep dependency on digital and technological systems, and a political culture that had long struggled with questions of collective versus individual response to shared challenges. The United States military capability was, on paper, the most significant obstacle Ark would have faced in North America. The US Armed Forces at the time of Ark's arrival were the most technologically sophisticated in the world, with capabilities that included extensive aerospace assets, global power projection, sophisticated electronic warfare, and nuclear deterrent systems of enormous destructive potential. The question of how those capabilities translated against Ark is one the law addresses only obliquely, but what it suggests is that the mismatch between Ark's specific attack profile and the threats that US military doctrine was designed to address created a situation where the most powerful military in history was in many respects badly equipped to respond effectively to what Ark was actually doing. The US military's dependency on digital and electronic infrastructure was itself a vulnerability in the context of Ark's infrastructure targeting campaign. Modern military operations at the level of sophistication the US maintained were deeply dependent on satellite communications, on digital command and control systems, on GPS navigation, on networked logistics management, on the kind of electronic environment that Ark's campaign appears to have disrupted aggressively, a military that can no longer communicate effectively, that has lost its logistics management capability, that cannot coordinate between its many distributed units, is not the same military that its paper specifications describe. The law suggests this disruption happened faster and more comprehensively than US military planners had modelled, in part because no planning exercise had ever modelled Ark specifically. The civilian population of the United States faced Ark's infrastructure disruption with a dependency profile that in some ways was the extreme case of the general vulnerability pattern. An enormous country with the majority of its population concentrated in a relatively small number of major metropolitan areas. Food systems that were geographically separated from most of the population by thousands of kilometers of supply chain. Water systems that required continuous energy inputs to function. A healthcare system of enormous technical capability but enormous infrastructure dependency. A cultural emphasis on individual self-reliance that paradoxically coexisted with a practical daily life that was completely dependent on collective infrastructure. When Ark removed the infrastructure, the gap between the cultural ideal of self-reliance and the practical reality of infrastructure dependency became immediately, painfully apparent. The geography of the United States is, in the long run, a significant factor in thinking about survival. The country contains an enormous diversity of environments, many of which are fundamentally capable of supporting human life without the sophisticated infrastructure overlay that Ark targeted. The agricultural heartland of the Midwest, the river systems of the interior, the forests of the Pacific Northwest and the Appalachians, the relatively mild and productive climate zones of much of the South and West, all of these represent natural resource bases that could support human communities at various scales if those communities had the knowledge and organization to access them. The question is whether sufficient numbers of people with sufficient knowledge survived the initial crisis in close enough proximity to those resources to form viable communities. The firearms culture of the United States, while often a source of controversy in normal times, appears in the law as a factor with complex and sometimes counterintuitive effects on post-Ark survival. A population with high levels of personal weapon ownership was a population that could defend itself and its resources without requiring functional government to provide that defense. In the specific conditions of post-Ark community formation, where communities needed to protect themselves from both Ark activity and from other human groups competing for scarce resources, that capacity for self-defense was a meaningful survival asset. At the same time, the availability of weapons also meant that conflicts between human groups were more lethal than they might otherwise have been, and the law implies that the early period of American post-Ark community formation was characterized by significant human-on-human violence, as well as Ark-related casualties. Canada presents an interesting contrast to the United States in several respects that the law points toward. A smaller population spread across an enormous geographic area, with a significantly lower per capita infrastructure density than its southern neighbour. Strong communities in certain regions that were already adapted to functioning in remote, resource-limited conditions. A political culture that had, at least in some of its traditions, a stronger emphasis on collective action and mutual support than the American individualist tradition. And a climate that, while harsh in many parts of the country, was associated with communities that had developed specific practical skills and social structures for surviving in difficult conditions. The French-Canadian communities of Quebec in particular had cultural characteristics that the law seems to point toward as potentially significant for post-Ark survival. The First Nations and Indigenous communities of North America are a thread in the law that deserves careful attention. These communities, which had maintained distinct cultural traditions, languages, and in many cases practical knowledge of pre-industrial land management and subsistence strategies, found themselves in a post-Ark world that had in some horrifying ways destroyed the settler colonial civilization that had marginalized them while leaving them with knowledge and relationships that were suddenly extremely relevant. The law handles this dimension of the story carefully, pointing toward it without oversimplifying it. The specific practical knowledge of particular landscapes, the specific relationships with animal and plant populations, the specific community organizational traditions, all of these were genuinely valuable in the post-Ark context in ways that the law acknowledges. Mexico's experience of Ark's invasion would have differed from that of the US and Canada in ways shaped by its specific social and economic characteristics at the time. A country with significant inequality, with large rural populations still practicing agriculture at relatively low levels of technological sophistication, with strong family and community networks that functioned partly as informal social security systems because formal systems had never been adequate for the whole population. Many Mexican communities, particularly in rural areas, were already practicing forms of community organization and collective resource management that were well adapted to a world with less reliable infrastructure. The Ark invasion would have hit Mexican cities with the same devastating force. It hit all major urban centers, but the rural and semi-rural populations may have had a resilience profile closer to the lower infrastructure dependency communities we discussed in the global context chapter. The specific geography of the North American continent is worth mapping in terms of Ark's likely activity patterns. The game's law suggests that Ark targets infrastructure with priority, which means that the most infrastructure-dense areas of North America, the megalopolis corridor of the northeastern United States, the Los Angeles Basin, the Greater Chicago metropolitan area, the Texas Urban Triangle, the coastal cities of California, would have been hit earliest and hardest. The vast agricultural interior, the rural south, the mountain west, the northern forests, the Arctic communities of Canada and Alaska, these would have been lower priorities for Ark's initial campaign, giving the communities in those areas more time and potentially more capacity to adapt before Ark's attention turned toward whatever remained in those less densely developed zones. The specific character of Ark activity in North American wilderness environments is something the law hints at in ways that are suggestive. Ark units operating in dense wilderness environments seem to behave differently than they do in urban and suburban settings. The terrain complicates their movement patterns in ways that give human communities certain tactical advantages that simply do not exist in open urban environments. Communities that retreated into forested, mountainous, or otherwise complex terrain may have found that Ark's campaign, while still present and still dangerous, was less comprehensively effective than in areas where the landscape offered no natural concealment or obstacle. The survival communities that developed in those environments reflect this in their specific tactical knowledge and cultural relationship with the landscape. The religious communities of North America represent an interesting thread in thinking about post-Ark survival. Religious communities, particularly those that had maintained strong internal organization, communal living traditions, and practical self-sufficiency as part of their theological commitments, had characteristics that translated very well into post-Ark survival conditions. Communities that had already been practicing some degree of separation from mainstream infrastructure dependency, communities with strong traditions of mutual aid, communities with established systems of internal governance and resource management. All of these had elements in place that would have supported survival in ways that more conventionally organized secular communities would have had to improvise from scratch. The role of universities and technical institutions in North American post-Ark survival is something the law addresses indirectly through the knowledge base that survivor communities demonstrate. The concentration of technical and scientific knowledge in North American universities, combined with the young population of students and researchers who were present in those institutions at the time of Ark's arrival, suggests that a significant quantity of technical human capital survived the initial crisis in and around university communities. Whether those communities were able to leverage that knowledge effectively in the immediate term, or whether the knowledge sat dormant, waiting for the conditions in which it could become useful again, is something the law hints at in the character of certain raider-faction approaches to technology and problem-solving. The specific challenge of feeding North America's pre-invasion population without the sophisticated agricultural infrastructure that had been developed to do so is enormous. The Corn Belt, the Great Plains wheat production, the California Central Valley agriculture, all of these were among the most productive agricultural systems in the history of human civilization. They were also among the most energy and technology intensive, dependent on mechanization, chemical inputs, complex water management systems, and sophisticated logistics networks. The sudden removal of all of those inputs would have collapsed production catastrophically in the short term. Even though the underlying land remained productive, the period of transition from the pre-Ark agricultural system to whatever smaller scale, lower technology system replaced it was almost certainly characterized by severe food insecurity for the surviving populations of North America. The Mississippi River and its tributaries represent a geographic feature of potentially enormous significance for post-Ark North American survival. This massive river system provides water transportation and access to agricultural land across a vast swath of the continent's interior. In the absence of most overland transportation infrastructure, a community with boats and knowledge of river navigation would have access to a transportation and communication network that Ark's campaign did not, and perhaps could not completely destroy. The river is simply there. It runs without electricity. It provides a natural highway through the heart of the continent. The communities that settled along it and learned to use it would have had connectivity advantages over communities that depended entirely on the land-based infrastructure that Ark disrupted. The fate of North American cities is one of the most significant questions in the continental survival narrative. These cities housed the majority of the continent's population. They were also the densest concentration of exactly the kinds of infrastructure that Ark targeted. The combination of population concentration and infrastructure density made North American cities both the sites of the greatest initial human losses and the sites of the most intense Ark activity in the immediate aftermath of those losses. The law suggests that the largest cities were effectively emptied of surviving populations within months of the initial invasion, not because all of their residents died, but because the conditions in the city itself became incompatible with survival once the infrastructure was gone, and the remaining population was too large to be supported by the resources accessible within the urban boundary. The suburban communities that ringed North American cities occupied an interesting middle ground in the survival calculus, close enough to major urban infrastructure to benefit from certain resources available in the urban remnants, far enough from the densest urban centres to have some distance from the most intense ARC activity, with some access to small-scale agricultural land, to residential stockpiles, to the tools and knowledge base of a population that included tradespeople and technically skilled workers alongside office workers. The suburban community survival stories that the law implies are some of the most complex and interesting in the North American context, because suburban communities were not designed for self-sufficiency, but turned out to contain the raw materials for it if the right people were there to apply them. The rural communities of the American South deserve particular attention in the context of North American post-ARC survival. A region with strong community traditions, relatively dispersed infrastructure, high rates of practical skills around construction, agriculture, hunting, and food preservation, and a cultural tradition of self-reliance that, whatever its other dimensions, translated into genuine survival capacity in the specific conditions ARC created. The climate of much of the South was also advantageous in that it reduced the immediate lethal threat of infrastructure loss compared to colder regions. A community that loses its heating system in Alabama is in a very different situation from one that loses it in Minnesota, particularly in the first winter after the invasion. The specific law references to North American survivor communities in the game point toward communities that have developed distinct identities and approaches, but that maintain some awareness of each other and some degree of informal trade and communication. The ideological diversity of the raider factions in the game has roots that extend to North American cultural and political traditions in ways that suggest these traditions were transmitted by survivors who came out of North American communities and joined the wider raider world. That transmission implies a pipeline of people moving between North America and the European environments the game depicts, or at minimum, a transmission of ideas across that distance through whatever communication channels remained open, and that pipeline implies surviving communities on the North American end. The indigenous oral history traditions of North America may prove to be among the most durable cultural achievements of the continent in the post-ARC world. In a world where digital and print records are increasingly inaccessible, where the infrastructure for maintaining them is gone, the communities that had maintained living oral traditions of knowledge transmission found themselves with a cultural technology that was perfectly adapted to the new conditions. Knowledge encoded in story and song and ceremony does not require electricity to access. It does not require a working library. It requires human beings who care about passing it on to other human beings who will continue passing it on. That is a technology that survived ARC because it was never dependent on the systems ARC destroyed. The fate of North American governmental structures is something the law points toward as having been catastrophic in the institutional sense, but not complete in the cultural sense. The formal governmental institutions of the United States, Canada, and Mexico did not survive ARC's invasion as functioning entities. The specific mechanisms of constitutional democracy, the federal system, the legal infrastructure, all of these depended on the communication and administrative systems that ARC disrupted. But the cultural and ideological commitments that those institutions embodied, the ideas about governance, about rights, about the proper relationship between the individual and the community, these did not disappear with the institutional forms that had expressed them. They survive in the heads and hearts of people who carry them into the post-ARC communities they form and lead. The military remnants of North America are depicted in the lore as having fragmented in ways that reflect the broader fragmentation of the societies they served. Some military units maintained their discipline and organization and became the nuclei of survivor communities in their operational areas. Others fragmented as soldiers left to look for and protect their families. Others still were destroyed in the chaos of the early period, either by ARC or by the confusion of a command structure that had lost its command before anyone had time to adjust. What remained was a distributed set of military-trained survivors who brought their skills and their weapons and sometimes their discipline into whatever communities they joined, but who rarely had the resources to reconstitute anything like the formal military structures they had been part of. The question of North American continental connectivity in the post-Ark world is one that the lore implies had a complex early trajectory that may have been developing towards something more organized by the time the game's present day begins. The early period was characterized by the kind of radical isolation that follows any complete infrastructure collapse. But over time, the human need for trade and communication and mutual support reasserted itself, and the continent's geography, with its great river systems, its mountain passes, its coastal routes, began to structure patterns of reconnection that did not require the technological infrastructure that had been destroyed. The communities that were forming along these natural transportation corridors were developing relationships that were slowly rebuilding something that looked, very distantly, like continental-scale human organization. The survival of North American agricultural knowledge in the post-Ark world is one of the more hopeful elements of the continental story. The United States had, at the time of the invasion, a significant community of people who practiced small-scale, low-technology farming, organic farming, permaculture, and related approaches that did not depend on the chemical and mechanical infrastructure of industrial agriculture. These communities, which had been a small minority in the pre-Ark agricultural world, found their knowledge suddenly enormously valuable when that industrial infrastructure collapsed. The network of farmers, seed savers, agricultural educators, and practical ecologists who had been developing alternatives to industrial agriculture for decades found that their life's work had prepared them precisely for this moment. The coastal communities of North America's Pacific coast represent a thread of the story that the lore points toward with particular interest. The Pacific coast, from Baja California to Alaska, encompasses an enormous range of environments and communities, but it shares certain characteristics that are relevant to the survival question: access to ocean resources, terrain that offers natural fortification and concealment, a tradition in parts of this coast of counterculture, and alternative community organization that had given certain communities experience with intentional collective living and resource sharing, and proximity to the Pacific Ocean as a potential route of connection to whatever was happening on the other side of the world, a connection that would prove significant, as we will discuss when we get to the East Asia chapter. Before we leave North America, it is worth noting one specific element of the lore that references the continent explicitly. There are mentions in certain audio logs and item descriptions of what seems to be an organized survivor community or network that developed in the interior of North America and that made deliberate choices about how to engage with the post-Ark world. This network appears to have developed a significant body of knowledge about Ark behavior, about sustainable survival strategies, and about the possibility of long-distance communication and trade. The specific details are fragmentary, but the existence of this reference is significant because it suggests that North American survival was not purely chaotic and fragmented in the long run, but developed towards something more organized and intentional in ways that may eventually bring it into more direct connection with the raider communities depicted in the game's primary environments. The final piece of the North American story that deserves attention before we move on is the question of what happened to the continent's children. the generation born in the first years after Ark's arrival, who are approaching adulthood in the game's present day, if the timeline is what it appears to be, grew up in a world that was already different from anything any living adult could fully prepare them for. Their relationship to the pre-Ark world is historical and second-hand. Their relationship to the post-Ark world is immediate and total. The specific shape of their values, their skills, their cultural identity, their hopes for the future is being determined by the communities that raised them and by the world those communities inhabit. They are, in a very real sense, the first generation of whatever comes next for the North American part of humanity. Chapter 4. Russia and Central Asia. The silence. Russia occupies a unique and deeply ambiguous position in the global picture that Ark Raiders lore constructs. Geographically, Russia is the largest country on the planet, spanning 11 time zones and encompassing an enormous diversity of environments from the Arctic tundra of Siberia to the subtropical regions of the Caucasus. Culturally, Russia at the time of Ark's arrival was a complex society with a powerful state tradition, a formidable military establishment, a significant nuclear arsenal, and a population that had direct living memory of catastrophic upheaval in the form of the Soviet collapse and the hardships of the 20th century more broadly. Russia's response to Ark's invasion and the fate of its vast territory and diverse populations is something the lore treats with a silence that is itself suggestive. The Russian military was, at the time of Ark's arrival, one of the most capable and well-equipped in the world. Significant conventional and nuclear forces, extensive missile defense infrastructure, a tradition of military thinking that had historically placed high value on adaptability and resilience in adverse conditions. The Soviet military doctrine tradition, which emphasized the ability to continue fighting even after catastrophic early losses, which planned for decentralized command in the event of communication failure, which prioritized the ability to operate in degraded technological environments, was deeply embedded in how Russian military forces were trained and organized. How much of that tradition survived into the specific military establishment that Ark encountered is something the lore does not tell us directly, but the doctrine itself, if it was still operative, would have made Russian military forces among the most resilient to the specific kinds of disruption Ark deployed. The Russian state's response to Ark in the early period is something that several pieces of lore reference obliquely. There are hints of significant early military engagement with Ark forces, of a response that was both large in scale and ultimately insufficient, and of a point at which the Russian state's command and control systems suffered the same kind of catastrophic disruption that affected other governments, leaving whatever remained of the state apparatus to try to function without the infrastructure it depended on. The specific timeline of Russian state collapse relative to other countries is not clear from the available lore, but the suggestion is that it happened, not that Russia somehow remained immune to the fundamental vulnerabilities that Ark exploited everywhere it went. What is interesting about Russia's post-Ark trajectory in the lore is the quality of the silence. The northern European environments that the game depicts are far from the Russian interior, but they are not so far that the fate of the largest country on Earth would be completely absent from the cultural and informational environment of survivor communities. The fact that references to Russia in the lore are scarce and tend to be vague and unconfirmed, that the transmissions from Russian territory are described as particularly sporadic and confusing, suggests something specific about the Russian situation that goes beyond simple geographic distance. One possible reading is that Russia's vast geographic extent made the breakdown of its communication systems particularly total, leaving communities spread across enormous distances with no effective way to inform the rest of the world about their status. Siberia is perhaps the most interesting and underexplored dimension of the Russian survival question. A territory of mind-boggling scale largely covered in forest and tundra, with an extremely sparse population concentrated in small urban centres, widely separated by wilderness. The urban centres of Siberia would have been vulnerable to ARC's infrastructure targeting in the same way all urban centres were, but the wilderness between them is something else entirely. The indigenous peoples of Siberia, who had maintained traditional lifestyles of reindeer herding, hunting, and fishing in one of the most challenging environments on Earth, represent a category of survivor community that the ARC invasion would have hit in a very different way from how it hit the dense urban and industrial communities of Western Russia. The indigenous peoples of Siberia, often collectively referred to in Russian as the Mali Narodi Severa, the small peoples of the north, had maintained ways of life that were not fundamentally dependent on the centralized infrastructure that ARC targeted. Their relationship with the land, their knowledge of how to survive in Arctic and subarctic conditions, their community structures organized around small mobile or semi-mobile groups that shared resources and knowledge, all of these were characteristics that the ARC invasion could not simply remove by cutting power lines and disrupting communication networks. These communities faced the ARC crisis from a position of practical capability that many far larger and more formally powerful communities could not match. The indigenous Siberian communities also had something else that was valuable in the post-ARC context. A set of cosmological and philosophical traditions that had for millennia addressed the question of how human beings should relate to a natural environment that was powerful, sometimes hostile, and ultimately not subject to human control. The shamanic traditions of Siberian peoples contained within them a sophisticated understanding of how to navigate a world where the forces arrayed against human communities might be incomprehensible, but had to be lived with, responded to, adapted to, rather than defeated in any conventional sense. This philosophical toolkit, while specific to its own traditions, may have had relevance to communities trying to figure out how to live in a world where ARC played the role of an incomprehensible but unavoidable natural force. Central Asia, comprising the former Soviet republics of Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan, presents a distinct survival picture that the lore points toward without fully exploring. This region was characterized at the time of ARC's arrival by a combination of modern urban development concentrated in relatively few cities and vast rural and semi-nomadic populations in the spaces between. The nomadic and semi-nomadic traditions of the Kazakh and Kyrgyz peoples, in particular, represented forms of community organization and land use that were both highly adapted to the specific environments of Central Asia and essentially independent of the centralized infrastructure that ARC disrupted. A herding family in the Kazakh steppe loses relatively little when the electricity grid goes down. Their fundamental survival systems were never dependent on it. The Aral Sea region and the other areas of Central Asia that had suffered significant environmental damage in the pre-ARC era present a more complicated survival picture. Communities living in already compromised environments with water scarcity and agricultural limitations that predated the ARC invasion faced the post-ARC reality with fewer natural resources to draw on than more environmentally intact regions. The pre-existing environmental stress in parts of Central Asia meant that the margins for error in the early survival period were smaller, and the communities there needed to respond with more precision and efficiency than communities in more resource-rich environments could get away with. Whether they succeeded in doing so is something the lore leaves open. The Silk Road traditions of Central Asia are worth considering in the context of post-ARC connectivity. For most of human history, Central Asia was not a peripheral backwater, but a hub of trade and cultural exchange between the great civilizations of East Asia, South Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. That role had diminished dramatically in the era of maritime and then air transport, but the geographic reality that Central Asia sits at the intersection of the major human population centers of Eurasia had not changed. In a post-Ark world where sophisticated long-distance transportation was severely degraded, the overland routes that connected the major surviving human communities across Eurasia might reassert their historical significance. Communities positioned along those routes might find themselves playing a role not unlike the one their ancestors played for centuries. The fate of the Russian military's nuclear arsenal is one of the most consequential and least clearly addressed questions in the Ark Raiders lore, as it pertains to Russia. The lore's general treatment of nuclear weapons suggests that nuclear exchange did not characterize the invasion's aftermath in the depicted regions, but Russia had the world's largest nuclear arsenal at the time of Ark's arrival, and what happened to it matters enormously for the global picture. One possible reading of the lore is that Ark's early targeting of military infrastructure specifically included nuclear command and control systems, effectively neutralizing the nuclear option before it could be meaningfully used. Another reading is that some nuclear assets survived Arky's disabling efforts and remain a factor in whatever geopolitical dynamics are developing in the post-Ark world. The Russian tradition of underground city building, of subterranean infrastructure, developed during the Cold War for the purpose of surviving nuclear conflict, is something that the lore hints at as potentially significant for Russian survival. The Soviet Union built extensive underground facilities, from simple bomb shelters to elaborate tunnel systems connecting government buildings and military installations, to what were reportedly genuine underground cities in certain areas. Whether those facilities survived Ark's infrastructure targeting campaign and what communities might have taken refuge in them is something the lore does not tell us directly. But the existence of those facilities and the culture of underground preparedness they represent suggests that Russia may have had more pre-built survival infrastructure than almost any other country on Earth, if that infrastructure remained accessible and functional. The cultural character of Russian communities that might have survived the initial invasion is something the lore touches on in ways that are interesting. The Russian cultural tradition contains within it a specific quality of relationship with catastrophe and suffering that has deep historical roots. The experience of enormous wartime losses in the 20th century, the experience of the Soviet era and its particular relationship with scarcity and collective sacrifice, the specific tradition of Russian Orthodox Christianity's theology of suffering and endurance, all of these contributed to a cultural psychology that was, in some ways, better adapted than most to a world of severe hardship, with no clear end date in sight. This is not to romanticize Russian suffering. It is to note that cultural preparation for adversity has genuine practical value in the specific conditions of post-Ark survival. The fate of Moscow as a city and as a cultural centre is something the lore implies without stating. A city of that size, that infrastructure density, that symbolic importance as a target, would almost certainly have experienced Ark's campaign with extraordinary severity. The disruption of Moscow's power and communication infrastructure would have cascaded through the entire formal administrative structure of the Russian state with devastating speed, given how much of that structure was concentrated in or dependent on the capital. The physical city of Moscow, the buildings, the infrastructure, the accumulated cultural materials of centuries, would have become a target zone of enormous complexity. What happened to the people of Moscow, where they went, what they built or found or lost, is one of the great untold stories in the Ark Raiders lore. The eastern provinces of Russia, particularly the Russian Far East and the communities along the Pacific coast, represent a part of the Russian story that is almost completely absent from explicit lore discussion, but that the evidence points toward as potentially significant. These communities, already somewhat isolated from the Western Russian centres of population and power even before Ark's arrival, had characteristics that were in some ways more aligned with Pacific Rim survival dynamics than with the Central Russian or Central Asian story. Their proximity to East Asia, their access to maritime resources, their experience with the specific conditions of the Russian Pacific environment, all of these factors might have shaped a post-Ark trajectory that diverged significantly from whatever was happening in Western Russia. The relationship between surviving Russian communities and Ark in the lore, insofar as it is depicted at all, seems to be characterized by a specific quality of tactical thinking about how to engage with Ark's presence. Russian military tradition emphasized the exploitation of geographic depth as a defensive strategy, the trading of space for time, the acceptance of tactical losses in exchange for strategic survival. In the post-Ark context, this translates into a style of survival that involves accepting Ark's control of certain zones while maintaining human presence in the spaces between, using the enormous geographic scale of the territory to keep human communities out of range of the most intense Ark activity while building the capacity to eventually challenge Ark's presence in more direct terms when conditions allow. The scientific and technical community of Russia is something the lore treats as a significant factor in whatever organized survival emerged from the initial chaos. Russia had, at the time of Ark's arrival, a significant scientific and engineering establishment, particularly in fields related to physics, mathematics, space science, and military technology. The fate of those scientific personnel and of the knowledge they carried is something the lore points toward as a matter of active concern within the survival communities depicted in the game. References to seeking out specific kinds of technical expertise, to the value of people who understand certain systems, suggest that the broader raider world is aware of and actively interested in whatever technical knowledge survived in Russian territories. The language communities of Russia and Central Asia are worth noting in the context of post-Ark cultural survival. Russia's linguistic diversity, encompassing hundreds of distinct languages and dialects alongside the dominant Russian language, mirrors in miniature the broader global picture of linguistic diversity facing an uncertain future. In the post-Ark world, the pragmatic drivers toward linguistic consolidation around surviving lingua francas would be significant. Russian itself, as one of the world's major languages, would likely continue to function as a communication medium across a wide geographic area. The smaller linguistic communities of Russia and Central Asia, many of which were already under pressure before Ark's arrival, face a post-Ark world in which the cultural infrastructure that had supported their survival and transmission is largely gone. The agricultural communities of the Russian countryside, the rural population that had never fully left the soil, even through the industrialization of the Soviet era, and the post-Soviet economic changes, are potentially among the most immediately resilient communities in the Russian story. Russia's vast agricultural interior, the Black Earth Belt of the Western Russian plains, contains some of the most naturally productive agricultural land in the world. Communities with the knowledge and tools to farm that land at a low technology level, without the energy and chemical inputs that industrial agriculture requires, would have access to food resources that could support significant populations over the long term. The question is whether those communities survived Ark's initial campaign and whether they were able to maintain their agricultural activity through the chaos of the early period. The steppes of Russia and Kazakhstan hold a particular significance in the post-Ark geography that the lore hints at without fully articulating. The vast open grasslands that stretch from the Ukrainian borderlands to Mongolia represent an environment with a very specific history in relation to human civilization. For most of the Holocene, the Eurasian steppe was not empty space but the highway along which cultures, technologies, and population movements travelled between the civilizations of East Asia and Europe. In a post-Ark world where the modern transportation infrastructure that had superseded the steppe highway is largely gone, the steppe's original function as a connector between the eastern and western extremes of Eurasia might reassert itself. Communities comfortable with steppe travel, with the knowledge and animals required to move across those vast open spaces, might find themselves playing a new version of the historical role that steppe peoples have always played in connecting the extremes of the Eurasian world. The Orthodox Christian monasteries of Russia, like the monasteries of Europe, represent a category of institution with characteristics that may have been unexpectedly relevant in the post-Ark crisis. Many Russian monasteries were self-sufficient agricultural communities before Ark, maintaining farms and workshops as part of their monastic practice. They had community structures, resources, and in some cases significant defensive architecture. The monastic tradition's emphasis on communal life, on prayer and work as equal components of a balanced existence, on the preservation and transmission of knowledge and culture, gave communities organized around monasteries a set of practices and structures that translated well into the specific demands of post-Ark survival. The law does not mention Russian monasteries explicitly, but the pattern is consistent enough with what is depicted in related European contexts that it is reasonable to infer their significance. The specific military legacy of the Cold War in Russia and the former Soviet space left behind physical infrastructure that had implications for Ark's invasion beyond the nuclear systems we have already discussed. Extensive early warning radar systems, deeply buried command facilities, dispersed military bases spread across an enormous geographic area, pre-positioned supply depots, military-grade communication systems designed to function even after catastrophic damage to civilian infrastructure. Some of this Cold War legacy infrastructure would have been targeted and destroyed by Ark in the early phases of the invasion. But an infrastructure that was specifically designed to survive enormous levels of destruction might have retained some functionality even under Ark's campaign, giving the communities that had access to it a significant advantage in the survival period. The Ural Mountains represent a geographic feature of potential significance in the Russian survival story. Historically, the Urals served as a boundary between the European and Asian parts of Russia, and they provided a degree of natural protection for the industrial communities that were relocated to their eastern slopes during World War II. In the post-Ark context, the Urals and the industrial and educational communities that had developed in their vicinity, cities like Yekaterinburg, Chelyabinsk, Perm, represent a region with a specific combination of technical knowledge, industrial capacity, and geographic position that might have supported a particularly robust form of post-Ark community development. The law points toward the Ural region, with hints that are just specific enough to suggest that whoever is responsible for certain elements of the wider post-Ark raider network has roots there. The specific post-Ark fate of Russian Arctic communities deserves mention because these communities represent an extreme case of the general principle that low infrastructure dependency societies had specific survival advantages in Ark's campaign. The indigenous and semi-indigenous communities of the Russian Arctic, the Nenets, the Evenks, the Khanty and Mansi, and dozens of other groups had maintained ways of life adapted to conditions that most of humanity would consider unlivable. Their survival in a post-Ark world would not require anything that their pre-Ark lives had not already required. The challenge for them was not survival in the physical sense, but the disruption of whatever degree of integration with the wider Russian economy and state their communities had developed, and the threat of Ark activity in areas where their communities intersected with the infrastructure targets that Ark prioritized. The broader Russian silence in the law, the fragmentary and unconfirmed character of information about the Russian interior is something that the game seems to treat as itself a mystery worth investigating. There are references to raider parties attempting to go east to gather information about what is happening in the vast territories beyond the game's depicted region. The people who undertake these expeditions rarely return with complete information. Some do not return at all. What they find when they do come back, the fragments of information they bring, paint a picture of a territory that is surviving in scattered, fragmented, sometimes organized, and sometimes chaotic ways across an almost incomprehensibly large landscape. Russia is not dead, but it is not easily knowable either, and that combination of survival and opacity is itself a significant feature of the post-Ark world. Chapter 5: East Asia: Fighting Machines with Machines. East Asia, at the time of Ark's arrival, was one of the most technologically advanced and economically dynamic regions on the planet. Japan, South Korea, China, and Taiwan together constituted a technological powerhouse that combined some of the world's most sophisticated manufacturing capability, some of the highest density urban environments anywhere, and some of the most advanced digital and electronic infrastructure in existence. The region also contained, in China particularly, the world's largest population, distributed across an enormous geographic range, from the megacities of the coast to the rural interior to the high-altitude plateau of Tibet. Understanding what happened in East Asia during Ark's invasion is crucial to any complete picture of global survival, and the lore, while not explicit about this region, contains enough threads to begin pulling together a picture. China's response to Ark's invasion is one of the most consequential and least clearly described events in the broader Ark Raiders lore context. A country with the world's largest standing army, an enormous and increasingly sophisticated defense industry, a government with a long tradition of treating national security threats with total mobilization seriousness, and a population of over 1 billion people distributed across a geographic area of continental scale. China's survival capacity was, in theory, enormous. Whether that capacity could be effectively mobilized against Ark's specific approach is a question the lore does not answer cleanly, but points toward with consistent uncertainty. The centralization of Chinese state infrastructure was both a potential strength and a significant vulnerability in the context of Ark's infrastructure targeting campaign. The extraordinary growth of Chinese digital infrastructure in the decades before Ark's arrival had created an enormously efficient and capable national network, but one that was also characterized by central nodes of control and management that represented exactly the kind of infrastructure targets that Ark's behavior patterns suggest it prioritized. The disruption of those central nodes would have cascaded through the system with a speed and comprehensiveness that the sheer scale of the country might eventually have been able to absorb, but the initial shock would have been enormous. The rural interior of China represents one of the most significant factors in the Chinese survival story. While China's coastal cities were among the most sophisticated and infrastructure-dependent urban environments in the world, the country's interior contained hundreds of millions of people living in conditions of much lower infrastructure dependency, maintaining agricultural traditions that went back thousands of years, organized in community structures that had survived numerous previous catastrophes and upheavals. These communities, dispersed across the enormous interior of the country, would have experienced Ark's invasion in a very different way from the coastal megacities. The disruption of the power grid matters far less when you have been living with unreliable electricity for your entire life. The specific technological character of Chinese industry at the time of Ark's arrival is worth considering in the context of what knowledge and manufacturing capacity might have survived. China had become the world's largest manufacturer across almost every category of goods, and that manufacturing capability was embedded not just in large automated factories, but in the knowledge and skills of hundreds of millions of industrial workers, engineers, and technicians. When the automated systems failed, the human knowledge that had always underlain them did not fail with it. People who understood how to make things from raw materials, who had worked in manufacturing contexts, who had the practical knowledge of industrial processes, were still there and were still capable of applying that knowledge in lower technology contexts. Japan presents a particularly interesting survival case in East Asia. A highly sophisticated island nation with a population of over 100 million people, a culture that combined extraordinary technological achievement with deep traditions of aesthetic appreciation for the natural world and a specific cultural philosophy around the acceptance of impermanence and catastrophe. Japan's geographic situation as an archipelago created the same basic vulnerability and potential advantage dynamic we discussed with the United Kingdom. The island geography was irrelevant as a defense against ARC, but it did mean that the cascade of infrastructure failure across national borders that affected continental Europe and Asia was not a factor for Japan. Japan's infrastructure collapse would have been its own collapse, not the echo of someone else's. The Japanese cultural response to the ARC crisis, extrapolated from what the law suggests about Japanese cultural tradition and what the game implies about post-ARC community formation, is one of the more fascinating questions in the East Asian survival story. A culture with a tradition of adapting to and finding meaning in catastrophe, with a specific aesthetic philosophy around the beauty of impermanence and the value of things that have been worn and repaired and worn again, with deep community traditions around collective effort and mutual support, with a strong tradition of craftsmanship and practical skill that had never been entirely supplanted, even by Japan's high-tech industrial development. All of these suggest a cultural toolkit well suited to the specific challenges of post-ARC survival. South Korea represents another specific case worth examining. A country that had, within living memory of the invasion, rebuilt itself from the ruins of devastating war and achieved extraordinary economic and technological development. A population with both the cultural memory of what rebuilding from catastrophe looks like and the practical experience of a society that had never been able to take its security for granted. A strong tradition of communal organization, of Han and Jong, the cultural concepts of shared suffering and deep emotional connection that underpinned South Korean community life in ways that might have translated well into the specific emotional and practical demands of post-ARC survival, and a military that had maintained a genuine war footing for decades, with draft traditions and civil defense practices that kept a larger portion of the population military trained than in many comparable societies. Taiwan is perhaps the most interesting case in East Asia in terms of ARC raiders' law implications. A highly developed island nation with a uniquely complex geopolitical history, a sophisticated and globally important technology manufacturing sector, particularly in semiconductor production, and a population that had spent decades in a state of heightened security awareness due to the cross-strait situation. Taiwan's semiconductor industry had made it one of the most strategically critical suppliers of technology components to the entire global economy. The implications of what happened to that industry and to the knowledge that underpinned it have ramifications for the broader post-ARC story that the law only begins to hint at. The specific nature of East Asian urban density is something that deserves extended consideration in the ARC survival context. Cities like Tokyo, Shanghai, Beijing, Seoul, and dozens of secondary Chinese cities contained concentrations of population that were extraordinary even by global standards. The law's suggestion that ARC prioritized infrastructure disruption as its primary mechanism means that these cities, which had among the most sophisticated and comprehensive infrastructure systems in the world, would have experienced that disruption with particular intensity and particular speed. The challenge of feeding, watering, and providing basic services to populations of tens of millions without functioning infrastructure is not a challenge that can be solved with improvisation at the community level. The acute population pressure of East Asian megacities in the immediate post-invasion period would have created humanitarian catastrophes of almost incalculable scale. The flight from the cities in the East Asian context would have created population movement on a scale that is difficult to fully imagine. Tens of millions of people moving from the coast and the megacities toward the interior, toward the agricultural regions, toward any environment that could support life without the infrastructure that had just been destroyed. That movement would have been both necessary and catastrophically difficult. The infrastructure for moving large numbers of people, the transportation networks, and fuel supplies and food distribution systems would have been exactly what ARC had just disrupted. The population movement itself would have been carried out largely on foot and by whatever pre-motorized transportation could be improvised, through terrain that was simultaneously chaotic with other refugees and patrolled by ARC units responding to the human movement. The Chinese military's response to ARC, while not explicitly described in the law, is something that the game implies was significant and ultimately insufficient. China's military had been in the process of rapid modernization for decades before ARC's arrival, developing capabilities that were genuinely sophisticated and that would have presented ARC with a more challenging adversary than many other national militaries. But the modernization that had made the Chinese military more capable had also made it more dependent on the digital and electronic infrastructure that ARC targeted. The balance between Chinese military capability and the specific vulnerabilities that ARC's campaign exploited is one of the more important, unresolved tensions in the global ARC narrative. The Buddhist and Taoist communities of East Asia represent a spiritual and cultural tradition with some interesting survival implications. Communities organized around temples and monasteries with traditions of communal life, agricultural self-sufficiency, and a philosophical relationship with impermanence and suffering that in some ways paralleled what we noted about the Russian Orthodox tradition. The Buddhist emphasis on present moment awareness, on the acceptance of what cannot be changed and the focus on what can be, on the value of community and the practice of compassion, all of these were cultural resources that communities drawing on this tradition could bring to bear on the specific challenges of post-ARC existence. The agricultural traditions of East Asia, which represented some of the most intensively developed and productive farming cultures in human history, are a factor of enormous significance for survival. Rice agriculture in particular, the foundation of much of East Asian civilization, was practiced using techniques that had been refined over millennia and that did not fundamentally require modern industrial inputs. A farmer who knows how to grow rice on terraced hillside fields using traditional methods does not lose that knowledge when the power grid goes down. The survival of rice cultivation knowledge and the communities that carried it would have been crucial to the long-term survival of large populations in the East Asian mainland, Japan, and Southeast Asia. The specific challenge of water management in the densely populated river deltas and agricultural plains of China and Southeast Asia is something the law implies was a critical factor in the early survival period. These regions depended on sophisticated irrigation and flood control systems that required ongoing management and energy inputs. The disruption of those systems would have created immediate agricultural crises in the most productive farming regions of the world. The management of the Yellow River, the Yangtze, the Mekong, the Pearl River, all of these were critical, not just for agriculture, but for basic water supply to enormous populations. What happened to those management systems and to the communities that depended on them in the early period of ARC's campaign is something the law points toward as having been catastrophic in immediate terms, but recoverable in the medium term, where community organization was sufficient. The maritime traditions of East Asia are perhaps the most significant geographic factor in thinking about post-Ark connectivity and survival in this region. The Pacific coasts of China, Japan, and Korea had given rise to some of the world's most sophisticated maritime traditions. The knowledge of how to build and sail ocean-going vessels, how to navigate using celestial and environmental cues, how to harvest the resources of the sea was embedded in coastal communities throughout the region. In a post-Ark world where overland infrastructure was severely compromised, the sea routes between the East Asian islands and coasts, and between East Asia and the rest of the Pacific Rim, might have become the primary channels of connectivity between surviving communities, a new version of the ancient maritime Silk Road that had connected these civilizations before the age of industrial land transport. The reference in the game's lore to equipment and materials with East Asian manufacturing origins that found their way into the Northern European survivor communities is one of the most tantalizing hints about the state of global connectivity in the post-Ark world. The fact that objects made in East Asia ended up in the game's environments implies not just survival of East Asian communities, but enough ongoing connection between East Asia and the rest of the world that goods were still flowing, however slowly and sporadically, across the enormous distances involved. That flow implies maritime activity, implies communities willing and able to engage in long-distance trade, implies a level of post-Ark economic organization that goes well beyond mere subsistence. The technological knowledge that was concentrated in East Asia's industrial and research institutions represents one of the most significant intellectual assets of the post-Ark world. The engineers, scientists, and technical workers who built and maintained the world's most advanced manufacturing systems carried in their heads knowledge that was immediately valuable for maintaining and eventually rebuilding complex technical capabilities. The specific challenge was finding ways to apply that knowledge in the drastically reduced resource environment of the post-Ark world, to figure out which elements of technological civilization could be maintained or rebuilt with the available materials and energy, and which would have to wait for a more complete recovery that might be generations away. The fate of East Asia's technological knowledge base is something the lore points toward as a matter of active concern in the broader post-Ark survivor world. There are references to the value of finding people with specific technical knowledge, to expeditions aimed at recovering not just physical materials but intellectual assets, people and documents, and encoded knowledge systems that represent the condensed learning of centuries of technological development. The fact that this kind of knowledge recovery is depicted as a raider activity implies that the knowledge exists somewhere out there, that it survived the initial catastrophe in some form, and that connecting to it is both possible and worth the considerable risk that any such expedition entails. Chapter 6. The Middle East between war and survival. The Middle East at the time of Ark's arrival was a region already characterized by significant instability, by the intersection of numerous competing interests, by the specific challenge of maintaining large populations in environments where water and agricultural land were already under severe pressure. It was also a region with extraordinary cultural and historical richness, with cities that represented some of the oldest continuously inhabited places on Earth, and with populations that had, throughout those long histories, developed sophisticated approaches to the specific challenges of survival in arid and semi-arid environments. Ark's invasion hit this region at a particular moment in its history, and the outcome was shaped both by the region's vulnerabilities and by the remarkable depth of its adaptive resources. The oil and gas infrastructure of the Middle East was among the most sophisticated and globally significant industrial infrastructure in the world at the time of Ark's arrival. Refineries, pipelines, liquefaction plants, distribution networks, all of this represented exactly the kind of complex, energy-related infrastructure that ARC's targeting approach appears to have prioritized. The disruption of Middle Eastern energy infrastructure would have had immediate global consequences, not just for the region itself, but for the interconnected global energy system that depended on it. Within the region, the communities that had organized their economies and social systems most completely around the energy industry found themselves simultaneously without their primary economic resource and without the infrastructure to maintain the standard of living that resource had supported. The contrast within the Middle East between the wealthy Gulf states, with their extraordinarily infrastructure-dependent economies and high per capita energy consumption, and the older agricultural and pastoral communities of the broader region, is a contrast that the ARC invasion would have made dramatically visible. The Gulf states, with their air-conditioned cities in extreme desert environments, their desalination-dependent water supplies, their food systems almost entirely dependent on imports and refrigerated distribution, were in many ways among the most acutely vulnerable communities in the world to ARC's infrastructure targeting approach. Remove the power and the cooling and the desalination and the food imports from a city like Dubai or Riyadh, and you have an almost immediately uninhabitable environment for most of the urban population. By contrast, the communities of rural Yemen, of the agricultural regions of the Levant, of the oasis communities of Arabia and the Fertile Crescent, communities that had maintained subsistence, agricultural and pastoral practices through centuries of political upheaval and economic marginalization, had survival characteristics that were far more robust in the specific conditions ARC created. The knowledge of how to grow food in an arid environment without industrial irrigation systems, the knowledge of where water was in the landscape and how to access it, the social structures organized around the management of scarce resources, the cultural traditions around hospitality and mutual aid that had evolved in an environment where the failure of a single household could be catastrophic and communal support was genuinely life or death. All of these were genuine survival assets. The Bedouin communities of the Arabian Peninsula and the Levantine interior represent an extreme case of the low infrastructure dependency survival advantage. Communities organized around mobility, around the ability to move between water sources and grazing areas, around the maintenance of specific social networks that gave access to resources across wide geographic areas, around the cultural knowledge encoded in oral traditions about navigation, animal husbandry, and resource management in desert environments. The ARC invasion, as devastating as it was to the urban and industrial communities of the region, may have touched the most traditional Bedouin communities relatively lightly in the most immediate sense. Their survival systems were not dependent on what ARC destroyed. The specific religious significance of the Middle East is a factor in the post-ARC dynamics of the region that the law acknowledges through the ideological dimensions of certain raider faction positions. The region contains sites of extraordinary religious importance for three of the world's major religions, and the communities associated with those sites carried the weight of that significance into the post-ARC period. Religious communities are often characterized by the same features that support post-ARC survival: strong internal organization, traditions of communal life and resource sharing, commitment to the preservation and transmission of cultural and intellectual heritage, and a philosophical framework that addresses the meaning of catastrophic suffering in ways that support community resilience rather than individual despair. The water situation in the Middle East in the post-ARC era is one of the most critical and specific challenges that the law implies without fully addressing. The pre-ARC water stress in the region was already acute, with many countries operating at or beyond the sustainable limit of their natural water resources. The disruption of the desalination and water management infrastructure that had made the current population levels in arid parts of the region possible would have created an immediate and non-negotiable survival crisis. The communities that survived would be the ones that could find and access water, that understood the ancient water management systems that predated industrial desalination, that could follow the rains and the seasonal rivers that the pre-modern communities of the region had organized their lives around. The ancient agricultural techniques of the Fertile Crescent region, the birthplace of human civilization's agricultural tradition, represent a knowledge base of enormous historical depth that the post-Ark world might have found extremely valuable. Irrigation systems, crop varieties, soil management approaches, all of these had been developed over millennia in response to the specific challenges of farming in the specific environments of this region. The communities that maintained living connections to these ancient techniques, or that could recover them from historical sources, had access to agricultural knowledge that had been demonstrated to work in exactly the conditions the post-Ark world created. The conflict dynamics of the Middle East at the time of Ark's arrival complicate the survival story in ways the lore acknowledges without fully resolving. A region characterized by multiple active conflicts, by long-standing territorial and political disputes, by communities with deep grievances against each other, entered the Ark crisis with a set of human conflict dynamics that did not simply dissolve in the face of a shared non-human threat. The lore's treatment of post-Ark human conflict dynamics suggests that existing human conflicts did not end when Ark arrived. They continued, sometimes with reduced intensity, as resources were redirected towards survival, sometimes with increased intensity as resource scarcity made existing territorial disputes more urgent. The Kurdish communities that span the borderlands of Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran represent an interesting case study in post-Ark regional survival. Stateless and politically marginalized in the pre-Ark world, the Kurdish communities had developed specific social and cultural resilience precisely because they could not rely on state institutions for their security and welfare. Mountainous terrain that provided natural protection, strong community organizational traditions, a culture of practical self-reliance built over generations of living in difficult environments without reliable external support. In the post-Ark world, where the state structures that had marginalized the Kurds were suddenly as absent as every other institutional structure, the Kurds' pre-existing resilience and their relationship with their specific geographic environment gave them survival assets that many formerly more powerful communities lacked. The archaeological record of the Middle East, which contains evidence of how previous civilizations responded to catastrophic disruption, including major climate events, invasions, and societal collapses over thousands of years, is an intellectual resource that the survivors of the region could potentially draw on. The Middle East had experienced its own Ark-like events before, in a metaphorical sense. The collapse of the Bronze Age civilizations, the various periods of drought-induced agricultural crisis, the multiple waves of conquest and reconstruction. The knowledge embedded in the region's cultural traditions about how to survive catastrophic disruption was not just theoretical. It had been tested and refined over millennia of lived experience. The specific Ark behavior patterns in desert environments is something the lore hints at as being somewhat different from Ark behavior in temperate forested or urban environments. The extreme temperatures, the minimal electromagnetic interference, the clear sightlines of open desert terrain, all of these create conditions in which Ark unit behavior may be modified in ways that survival communities could potentially exploit. There are references in the lore to strategies that seem to work specifically in desert environments, to approaches that take advantage of heat and visibility conditions that Ark units may not navigate with the same efficiency as they show in cooler, more complex terrain. The communities that developed these desert-specific survival strategies represent an important thread in the global knowledge base about how to live in a world where arc is always present. The Persian Gulf as a maritime environment is worth considering in the context of post-arc connectivity. Relatively shallow, enclosed, with a well-charted coastline and a maritime tradition of dhow sailing that predated the age of industrial shipping by millennia, the Gulf might have served as one of the primary channels of connectivity between surviving communities in the Arabian Peninsula, Iran, Iraq, and the Indian subcontinent. Traditional maritime navigation techniques, which had been almost entirely displaced by modern electronics in the pre-arc era, would have retained their relevance in a world where the electronic navigation systems were unreliable or gone. Communities that maintained the knowledge of how to sail the Gulf by traditional means would have had access to a trading network that could support significant post-arc economic activity. The specific situation of Iran in the post-arc narrative is worth extended consideration. A country with a population of over 80 million at the time of the invasion, significant geographic diversity from the Caspian coast to the Persian Gulf, a long history of civilization and cultural achievement, and a specific political and cultural situation that gave it both vulnerabilities and resilience assets that were distinct from those of its neighbours. The Iranian plateau, with its high altitude and cooler climate relative to the Gulf region, contained agricultural communities that were somewhat less immediately dependent on the most sophisticated water management infrastructure. The specific Iranian cultural tradition, with its emphasis on poetry, literature, the art of living beautifully within constraint, carried intellectual and emotional resources into the post-arc period that the survival communities that descended from Iranian culture could draw on. The specific challenge of the arc invasion in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian situation is something the law points toward as having had complex and somewhat unexpected outcomes, a situation of deep conflict and mutual distrust entering a period where a shared, incomprehensible, external threat imposed a new set of priorities on both communities. The law's treatment of how previously conflicting human communities navigated the arc crisis suggests a complex picture, rather than a simple one, of conflict suspended or of conflict intensified. Both things seem to have happened in different places and different times, with the outcome in any specific community depending heavily on the specific local leadership and the specific resource situation at the critical moments of decision. The archaeological sites of the Middle East and the communities of scholars and researchers who had devoted their lives to studying them represent an interesting thread in the intellectual survival story of the region. The deep history embedded in those sites and in the scholarly knowledge about them is a form of intellectual resource that the post-arc world would have value for even in the most practical terms. Understanding how previous civilizations managed water in arid environments, how they organized food production in the specific geographic conditions of the Fertile Crescent, how they built resilient communities in the specific challenges of the Levantine climate, all of this historical knowledge was potentially applicable to the specific challenges of post-arc survival in the same region. The Saudi Arabian situation in the post-arc world is one of the more dramatically transformed stories on the planet, at least as the law implies it. A country whose entire modern existence was organized around a single resource, oil, and the infrastructure for extracting, refining, and distributing it, found that resource simultaneously useless in the post-arc world and the target of active arc disruption. The communities of the Arabian Peninsula that survived were not the ones organized around the oil economy. They were the ones that maintained connections to older ways of life, the agricultural oasis communities, the pastoral communities, the communities along the traditional pilgrimage routes that had sustained life in the region for centuries before oil was ever discovered. The specific spiritual significance of Mecca and the broader Hajj infrastructure in the post-arc world is something the law touches on in ways that are subtle but important. The pilgrimage to Mecca had been one of the largest annual human gatherings in the world before Ark, drawing millions of people from every Muslim-majority country. In the post-Ark world, that gathering had obviously ceased to function in any organised sense, but the significance of Mecca as a symbolic centre and the religious and cultural traditions associated with the pilgrimage continued to matter to millions of surviving Muslims in ways that shaped the values and aspirations of the communities they formed. The orientation toward Mecca, metaphorical and spiritual, if no longer physically practicable, gave those communities a sense of connection to each other and to a tradition that transcended the devastation of the material world. The post-Ark experience of Middle Eastern communities contains within it the possibility of a form of return, a return to older, pre-industrial, pre-oil ways of life that the region had practiced successfully for thousands of years before the 20th century transformed everything. This return is not voluntary, and it is not easy. It involves enormous loss and pain, and the death of hopes and aspirations that were real and legitimate. But the knowledge and the landscape that supported those older ways of life are still there. The ancient irrigation systems of the Fertile Crescent are damaged, but some are recoverable. The plant varieties adapted to the specific conditions of the region still exist in seed banks and in the knowledge of older farmers. The social structures organised around the management of shared water resources can be rebuilt. The question is whether enough people with enough of the right knowledge survive to do the rebuilding. The question of connection between Middle Eastern surviving communities and the wider world is one that the law hints at through the trade and communication networks that the game implies exist between distant survivor communities. The Middle East, for most of human history, was a hub rather than a periphery in the global network of human exchange. The geographic centrality of the region, sitting between Africa, Europe, and Asia, made it a natural meeting point for goods, people, and ideas moving between the major human civilizations. In a post-Ark world, where the modern transportation infrastructure that had shifted global trade routes to sea and air has been severely compromised, the overland centrality of the Middle East might reassert itself in ways that could give surviving Middle Eastern communities a connectivity advantage that their pre-Ark ancestors would have recognized. Chapter 7. Africa, the most resilient continent. Africa presents a survival picture in the context of Ark Raiders lore that is in many ways the most complex and most important of any region on the planet. Complex because Africa is not a single story, but 54 countries with vastly different populations, climates, economic systems, cultural traditions, and relationships to the global infrastructure networks that Ark targeted. Important because the specific characteristics of many African communities, particularly their relative independence from the most infrastructure-intensive systems that Ark prioritized, meant that the African survival story may be substantially more robust than the stories of regions that were more deeply integrated into the global technological infrastructure. The infrastructure profile of Africa at the time of Ark's arrival was highly variable across the continent. The densely populated coastal cities of West Africa, the megacities of Lagos and Kinshasa and Nairobi, were thoroughly integrated into global supply chains and digital infrastructure systems in ways that made them as vulnerable to Ark's campaign as cities anywhere else. But the vast rural interior of the continent, the agricultural communities of the West African savanna, the pastoralist communities of East Africa, the farming communities of the Great Lakes region, the traditional communities of the Congo Basin, all of these had characteristics that differed dramatically from the urban coastal profiles. The specific characteristic that may be most significant for African survival in the Ark context is the continent's historic under-integration into the centralized infrastructure networks that Ark targeted. The development gap that had been treated as a crisis and a challenge in the pre-Ark world, the lack of reliable electricity, the inadequate water and sanitation infrastructure, the limited transportation networks, all of these represented a different relationship with the global infrastructure system than what existed in more developed regions. They were not advantages in any ordinary sense. They were the product of historical injustices and structural inequalities that caused enormous suffering in the pre-Ark world. But in the specific conditions of Ark's infrastructure targeting campaign, communities that had always functioned without reliable electricity had nothing to lose when Ark disrupted the electricity grid. Sub-Saharan African agricultural communities practicing forms of farming that combine traditional knowledge with varying degrees of modern inputs had a specific resilience profile in the Ark context. Traditional farming knowledge in Africa accumulated over thousands of years of adaptation to specific microclimates and ecosystems, represented a form of agricultural intelligence that did not require any external infrastructure to access. A farmer who knows which plants grow well together in the specific soil conditions of their valley, who understands the seasonal water patterns that determine planting schedules, who maintains seed varieties adapted to local conditions, is not dependent on the agricultural advisory systems, the chemical inputs, or the mechanical equipment that industrial agriculture requires. That knowledge survives Ark's campaign intact. The pastoral communities of East Africa, the Maasai, the Samburu, the Fulani of West Africa, the Tuareg of the Sahara margins, all of these communities maintained ways of life that were not fundamentally restructured by the kind of infrastructure disruption that Ark's campaign produced. The ability to follow cattle and goats and camels across the landscape in response to seasonal rainfall patterns does not depend on a functioning power grid. The social structures organized around the management of livestock and the negotiation of grazing rights do not require digital communication to function. These communities entered the post-Ark world essentially equipped for it, not because they were primitive, but because their sophistication was of a kind that Ark's campaign could not dismantle. The Congo Basin, the world's second largest tropical rainforest, represents a geographic environment with specific survival implications that deserve attention. The forest's extraordinary biodiversity provides an enormous range of food resources, medicinal plants, and construction materials. The communities that had lived in and around the forest for centuries, and the indigenous forest peoples who knew it most intimately, had access to survival resources that Ark's campaign could not fundamentally reduce. The forest is not an infrastructure system, it is a living ecosystem that continues to function regardless of what happens to the human technological overlay. Communities with the knowledge to access the forest's resources, to farm its edges, to harvest its bounty without destroying it, were in a position to survive the Ark crisis with their fundamental resource base intact. The specific Ark behavior patterns in dense tropical forest environments are something the law points toward as being distinct from Ark behavior in other environments. The electromagnetic environment of a tropical rainforest, the density of the canopy,